They said he wasn't worth $599, but in a hangar filled with champagne flutes, designer suits, and a $200 million jet polished to a mirror shine, it was him, the quiet man in the faded coveralls, grease still under his fingernails, who held the power to bring it all down. One signature. That's all it took. And he hadn't given it. This is the story of Logan Carter, a single father, a man nobody saw coming, and the moment he proved that dignity isn't something you can put a price tag on. If this story moves you, drop your city in the comments. Let me see how far this one travels. Hit that like button and stay until the very end. You won't regret it. The morning of the Kensington Aviation grand unveiling arrived the way big days always do in the aviation world. Loud, overstated, and soaked in money that most people will never see in their lifetime. Banners the size of billboard signs hung from the steel rafters of Hangar 7 at Meridian Executive Airport, each one carrying the Kensington Aviation logo in silver and deep navy. Floodlights had been installed overnight, turning the massive industrial space into something that looked more like a Broadway stage than a maintenance facility. A string quartet played near the entrance. Waitstaff in pressed white shirts moved through the crowd carrying trays of sparkling water and champagne. There were investors in Italian suits, executives with perfectly rehearsed smiles, journalists from 3 different aviation trade publications, and at least 2 camera crews from financial news networks who had been promised access to what Amelia Kensington was calling the most significant private aviation launch in a decade. The jet itself sat at the center of it all. The KA Sovereign, 63 feet of gleaming white fuselage, custom interior worth more than most people's homes, twin engines that could push it to Mach 0.92 at altitude. It was a beautiful aircraft. Nobody in that hangar would argue otherwise. Even Logan Carter, who had spent the last 11 years looking at aircraft the way a doctor looks at patients, with clinical honesty rather than admiration, had to admit it was a stunning machine. He just knew something was wrong with it. Logan arrived at the hangar at 5:47 that morning, same as he did every day. While the event crew was still setting up folding chairs and adjusting the angle of the spotlights, he was already in his coveralls, clipboard in hand, moving through the pre-event inspection checklist he had drafted himself. His toolbox sat near the nose of the aircraft. His coffee, long gone cold, sat on top of it. He wasn't supposed to be running a full inspection that morning. That wasn't the assignment. His supervisor, Dale Pruitt, had made it very clear 2 days prior that Logan's job for the unveiling was to stand near the aircraft, look professional, and answer any technical questions from investors who wanted to feel like they understood what they were looking at. "Your window dressing, Carter," Dale had said, not unkindly, but not gently either. "Smile, be present, don't bring your clipboard." Logan brought the clipboard anyway, because 6 weeks earlier he had found something, and in 6 weeks, nobody with the authority to do anything about it had taken him seriously. It started on a Tuesday in early March, during a routine secondary inspection on the KA Sovereign starboard aileron assembly. Logan had been assigned to verify the torque specifications on 17 fastener points along the trailing edge. Standard work, the kind of thing he could do half asleep after a decade on the floor. But on fastener point 11, something felt wrong. Not catastrophically wrong. Not something that would make the average person blink twice. Just wrong. The kind of wrong that only registers when you've spent 10,000 hours with your hands on aircraft and your brain has built up an unconscious library of what right feels like. He flagged it in his report that same day, submitted the paperwork through the standard maintenance tracking system, wrote 3 sentences explaining what he'd found, and requested a secondary review. Nothing happened. He followed up 2 weeks later with a more detailed report, attached photographs. Included his preliminary assessment of the structural stress implications if the defect was left unaddressed. He used clear language. He wasn't an alarmist. He just laid out what he saw and what he believed needed to happen before the aircraft received its final airworthiness certification. That report sat in Dale Pruitt's inbox for 9 days before Dale sent back a 2-line response. Reviewed, will escalate as appropriate. Stand by. Stand by. Logan stood by. He waited. He checked the maintenance tracking system every morning. He sent 2 more internal messages. He stopped Dale in the hallway outside the crew break room on a Wednesday afternoon and asked him point blank whether the aileron issue had been reviewed by the structural team. Dale looked at him with the particular exhaustion of a man who is being asked to do something uncomfortable on behalf of a company he had given 20 years to. The timeline is tight, Logan. You know what the launch date means for this company. I know what an unresolved structural defect means for the people who get on that plane, Logan said. Dale didn't have a good answer for that. He just told Logan to trust the process and walked away. The process did not produce results. By the time the morning of the unveiling arrived, Logan had submitted 4 formal reports, 2 informal written requests, and 1 verbal escalation to Dale's supervisor, a senior operations manager named Richard Bale, who had listened to Logan for approximately 4 minutes before explaining that the KA Sovereign had already passed its manufacturer's inspection and that Logan's concerns, while noted, were unlikely to represent anything more than a calibration variance. Calibration variance, Logan repeated, standing in Richard Bale's office doorway. We appreciate your diligence, Carter, genuinely, but we have engineers who signed off on this aircraft. We have a launch in 6 days. We need everyone pulling in the same direction. Logan nodded slowly. He thanked Richard Bale for his time. He walked back to the floor. He pulled out the maintenance tracking system on his laptop and made sure every single report he had submitted was time-stamped, saved, and backed up to his personal encrypted drive. Then he went home to his daughter. Sophie Carter was 7 years old and had her mother's eyes, dark brown, wide-set, the kind that made you feel like she was reading you even when she was just asking what was for dinner. She was in 2nd grade at Pineview Elementary, and her current obsession was the solar system, specifically the fact that Jupiter had 95 known moons, which she considered to be an unfair amount. It's hoarding, she told Logan seriously over mac and cheese one night. Jupiter is hoarding moons. Logan laughed. It was the kind of laugh that came from somewhere genuine, not the polite surface-level laugh he sometimes produced at work when someone made a joke he didn't quite find funny. A real one. The kind that used his whole chest. Sophie was the reason he got up in the morning. She was also the reason he was very careful about the work he did, because he understood in a way that was personal rather than abstract that the people who climbed into aircraft were someone's reason to get up in the morning. Some of them were the people waiting at home. Some of them were the parents. The kids. The spouses who had already lost someone and couldn't afford to lose again. Logan had lost someone. He knew what that looked like from the inside. His wife, Maya, had died 4 years ago. Not in an aviation accident, in a car wreck on Route 9 in February, black ice, a curve that came too fast. Logan had gotten the call at work, midway through a turbine inspection. He remembered putting down the borescope very carefully, as though setting it down gently would somehow balance out the thing that was happening to him. He remembered walking to the parking lot and sitting in his truck for 40 minutes before he could drive. He didn't talk about Maya much, not because the grief had faded. It hadn't, not entirely, the way people said it would, but because he had learned that grief shared too freely became a burden for the people around you. And Logan Carter did not like burdening people. What he did instead was work, and take care of Sophie, and make sure every aircraft he touched was as safe as it could possibly be, because he understood that safety was not an abstraction. It was the difference between someone going home and someone not going home. That was why he had filed 4 reports about the KA Sovereign's aileron assembly. And that was why, on the morning of the grand unveiling, he brought his clipboard. Brexit. The event was scheduled to begin at 10 o'clock. By 9:15, the hangar was already filling up. Logan moved through the crowd with his head down, not avoiding people exactly, but focused. He circled the aircraft twice, running his eyes along the surfaces with the particular attention of someone who knows exactly what he's looking for. Everything looked fine. That was the dangerous part. It almost always looked fine. He crouched near the starboard side and ran 2 fingers along a section of the trailing edge assembly, feeling for the slight irregularity he had documented 6 weeks ago. It was still there, subtle, the kind of thing that wouldn't show up on a visual inspection from 3 feet away, the kind of thing that wouldn't matter on a short-haul flight at lower altitude, the kind of thing that would absolutely matter under high-speed stress at cruising altitude if the atmospheric conditions were particularly unforgiving. He stood up and wrote 2 words on his clipboard. Still there. What exactly are you doing? The voice came from behind him, sharp and composed in equal measure. Logan turned around. He had seen photographs of Amelia Kensington before. The aviation trade press ran her face regularly. Youngest aviation CEO in the country, built her first charter company at 22, sold it at 25, launched Kensington Aviation at 27 with seed funding that would make most people's eyes water. She was 30 years old and operated with the controlled energy of someone who had learned early that momentum was everything and slowing down was indistinguishable from failure. In person, she was smaller than the photographs suggested. Not short exactly, but lean, compact, dressed in a slate gray blazer over a white silk blouse. Her dark hair pulled back with the kind of precision that communicated she had thought carefully about how she appeared before walking out the door. Her eyes were sharp, brown, focused, slightly impatient in the way that eyes get when they belong to someone who has 17 things to think about and very little patience for the 18th. She was looking at his clipboard. "I asked you a question," she said. "Final visual check," Logan said. He kept his voice neutral. "I wanted to verify a few things before the event." "You're a technician?" "Senior maintenance specialist, Logan Carter." Amelia glanced at his coveralls, then back at his face. There was a flicker of something in her expression, not quite dismissal, but the preliminary stage of it. "Today is not a maintenance day, Mr. Carter. Today is a celebration. You should probably—" "Ms. Kensington." He kept his voice even, not aggressive, not apologetic, just direct. "I've submitted 4 reports over the past 6 weeks about a structural concern on this aircraft. I'd like 5 minutes to walk you through what I found before. I'm aware of your reports." She said it the way people say things they are aware of, but have already decided not to act on. "They were reviewed." "They were acknowledged," Logan said. "That's different from reviewed." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a frown, but a reorganization around the eyes that communicated she was recalibrating how seriously she needed to take this conversation. Behind her, Logan could see Dale Pruitt moving through the crowd toward them with the urgent shuffle of a man who had spotted a situation developing. "Logan," Dale started. "The starboard aileron assembly has a manufacturing defect at fastener point 11 in the trailing edge section," Logan said, not loudly, but clearly. "Under standard flight conditions, it may never present a problem. Under high-stress conditions at cruising altitude, turbulence, rapid pressure change, extended high-speed flight, there is a structural failure risk that I cannot in good conscience certify around." Silence for approximately 3 seconds. Then Dale said, "Logan, this is not the time." "When is the time?" Logan asked. He wasn't raising his voice. He genuinely wanted to know. "Because I've been asking that question for 6 weeks, and I keep getting told it's not the time." Amelia Kensington looked at him for a long moment. Then she took a slow breath and made a decision that Logan would come to understand much later had cost her everything. "Escort him away from the aircraft," she said to Dale quietly. It happened fast, the way humiliating things usually do. Dale stepped forward and put a hand on Logan's arm, not rough, but firm, and began steering him sideways, away from the jet, toward the edge of the crowd. Logan didn't resist. He let himself be moved because making a physical scene was not something he had any interest in, and because he was already calculating his next move. But someone had seen. A reporter from Aviation Week had been standing nearby, close enough to catch fragments of the exchange. She pulled out a recorder instinctively. And the camera crew from the Financial News Network had been panning across the hangar at exactly the wrong moment and caught the image of a technician being physically guided away from the aircraft by a supervisor. None of that mattered yet. It would matter later. Right now, what mattered was what happened next. Amelia crossed the hangar floor toward the small, temporary stage that had been set up near the nose of the KA Sovereign. One of her PR handlers was at her elbow immediately, whispering something. She shook her head, a small, sharp movement, and stepped up onto the stage. The string quartet faded out. A microphone was placed in her hand. She smiled at the room, and it was a good smile, polished and warm and entirely convincing, the kind of smile that made people want to trust you. "Thank you all for being here," she began. "Today represents something I've been working toward for 3 years. The KA Sovereign isn't just an aircraft. It's a statement about what this company believes, that excellence and innovation can coexist, that we don't have to choose between ambition and quality. Applause. Genuine, enthusiastic. Logan stood at the edge of the crowd with Dale's hand still loosely on his arm, watching. Before we proceed, Amelia continued, and here something changed in her voice, a slight sharpening, a deliberate shift in register. I want to address a small disruption you may have witnessed a moment ago. She glanced toward Logan with an expression that was almost amused. One of our maintenance technicians decided this morning was a good time to request a repair that our engineering team has already reviewed and cleared, to the tune of... She paused, and someone near the stage handed her a printout, roughly $599 in additional labor costs. A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the room, the kind of laughter that comes not because something is funny, but because powerful people have laughed first, and it feels safer to agree. I respect dedication, Amelia said. Her voice was smooth, controlled, entirely confident. But I think we can all agree that a $599 concern is not what's standing between us and history today. More laughter. A few genuine smiles from investors who understood the subtext. This company is not going to let small thinking slow it down. Logan stood very still. He had spent 11 years being talked past, talked over, and talked about as though he wasn't standing directly in front of the people doing the talking. He understood the mechanics of what she was doing. She was reducing him, turning a legitimate safety concern into a punchline about a dollar amount, making the number small so that everyone in the room would associate his judgment with smallness. It was a precise and effective piece of social manipulation, and it was working exactly as she intended. The camera from the financial news network swung toward him. Logan didn't move, didn't change his expression. He looked at Amelia Kensington standing on that stage in her slate gray blazer, commanding a room full of people who believed in her absolutely. And he thought about Fastener Point 11 and what happens to an aileron assembly under high-speed atmospheric stress. Then he thought about Sophie, asking him what was for dinner. Then he thought about Maya. He uncapped his pen and wrote something else on his clipboard. Dale leaned toward him. Logan, don't. Logan looked at him. Don't what? Don't make this worse. Dale, Logan said quietly, I'm not the one making it worse. The applause from Amelia's remarks was still fading when Logan walked, not rushed, not confrontational, just walked, back to the center of the hangar floor, directly to where the KA Sovereign sat gleaming under the event lights. He stopped next to the nose. He reached into the inner pocket of his coveralls and pulled out a folded document. He unfolded it carefully. It was a copy of his most recent formal maintenance report, the fourth one, submitted 11 days prior, complete with timestamps, photographic documentation, his preliminary structural assessment, and at the bottom, a line he had added the night before specifically for this moment. As the senior maintenance specialist assigned to this aircraft's final certification, the undersigned has not authorized airworthiness approval for the KA Sovereign. This aircraft is not currently certified for flight operations. Signed, dated, witnessed by the Maintenance Tracking System's automatic timestamp. Dale saw the document from across the room, and his face changed color. Richard Bale, who had been standing near the investors section, saw it too. He took 3 quick steps forward and then stopped, because there was a reporter standing between him and Logan, and she was already looking. Amelia Kensington, from her position on the stage, watched all of this with the expression of someone who has just realized the ground under them is softer than it looked. Logan turned to face the room. He didn't step up onto the stage. He didn't take a microphone. He simply stood where he was, in his faded coveralls, with his clipboard and his document, and he said, in a voice that was not loud, but was very clear, I want to be transparent with everyone here. I'm Logan Carter, Senior Maintenance Specialist, and I am the person legally responsible for certifying this aircraft before it flies. I have not certified this aircraft. I have not certified it because I identified a structural defect 6 weeks ago and submitted 4 formal reports requesting a secondary engineering review, none of which resulted in the defect being addressed. The room had gone very quiet. The concern involves the starboard aileron assembly, specifically a manufacturing irregularity at the trailing edge that poses a risk under high-stress flight conditions. I'm not telling you this aircraft will crash. I'm telling you I can't promise you it won't, and that's the same thing as far as I'm concerned. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. A camera was rolling. Amelia stepped down from the stage. She crossed the floor toward him, and her composure was still in place, but it was working harder now. Logan could see it working. The slight tension around the jaw, the controlled pace of her stride, the way her hands had come together in front of her, fingers interlaced, which was either a gesture of calm or a way of keeping them from showing that they weren't. "Mr. Carter," she said, voice low, "I think you should step outside with me and we can—" "The maintenance records are in the system," he said, not cutting her off exactly, but not stopping either. "Anyone with system access can pull them right now. The timestamps are there. The reports are there. The responses to the reports are there." He held out the document. "This is a copy. The original is in the system. I also have copies on file." He paused. "And the FAA has the authority to pull those records anytime they want." The word FAA landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples went outward immediately. Investors shifted. Someone near the back of the hangar pulled out a phone. The reporter from Aviation Week raised her recorder higher. Richard Bale made it to Logan's side and said, very quietly and very carefully, "Logan, I strongly encourage you to lower your voice and come with us to—" "My voice is already low," Logan said, which was true. He hadn't raised it once. He looked at Amelia. She looked at him. In the space between them, something was passing that had nothing to do with the aircraft or the investors or the cameras or the reports. It was the particular exchange that happens when two people are seeing each other clearly for the first time, and neither of them entirely likes what they're finding. Logan spoke first. "I don't want your company to fail, Ms. Kensington." He said it simply, without heat. "I want your aircraft to be safe. Those are two things that should be the same goal." He set the document on the edge of a nearby work table, smoothed it flat with one hand. "When you're ready to address the aileron assembly, I'll be here, same as I've been." Then he picked up his toolbox from beside the nose of the aircraft, picked up his cold coffee, and walked to the far side of the hangar where a row of workbenches sat out of the light of the event cameras. He set his toolbox down. He sat on a metal stool. He looked at the back of his hands for a moment, the calluses across the palm, the permanent faint gray of grease that soap never quite got out of the lines of his knuckles. Not worth $599. He almost smiled. Behind him, Hangar 7 was coming apart at the seams. He could hear it without turning around, the rising pitch of voices, the sound of the string quartet stopping mid-note because no one had told them to keep playing, but the silence felt wrong. The sharp staccato of Amelia Kensington's heels on the hangar floor. Dale's voice, tense and clipped, talking to someone on a phone. Logan didn't turn around. He opened his clipboard to a fresh page and started writing up his notes from the morning's visual inspection. He had reports to file. The rest of that morning was something he would never fully be able to reconstruct in linear order because he wasn't watching most of it. He was at his workbench doing work. He heard things. He caught fragments. He heard Richard Bale say to someone, "Cannot legally fly without his certification. We need to—" He heard a female voice, one of the investors maybe, say, "Someone told me this has been an ongoing issue." He heard the sound of a camera crew repositioning. He heard, at one point, the particular silence that falls when a large group of people in a room are all waiting to see what the most powerful person in the room is going to do. And the most powerful person in the room hasn't decided yet. A junior technician named Ricky Soto came to stand near him around 10:40. Ricky was 24, 2 years on the job, still a little dazzled by everything, the kind of kid who watched tutorials on his days off because he genuinely loved aircraft. He was also, Logan had noticed, the kind of kid who paid attention to more than just the machinery. "You okay?" Ricky asked. Logan looked at him. "Yeah. You?" Ricky was quiet for a second. "That thing she said, about the $599. He paused. "That was messed up." "Yeah. Are you going to get fired?" Logan thought about it honestly. "Maybe," he said. "Probably depends on how the next few hours go." Ricky nodded slowly. "For what it's worth, I saw your first report, back in March. I was shadowing on a secondary inspection, and I saw you flag that fastener point. I thought you were right then. Logan looked at him for a moment. Why didn't you say anything? Ricky made a face that was mostly 24-year-old honesty. I didn't think anyone would listen to me. I figured if they weren't listening to you, they definitely weren't listening to me. Logan didn't respond to that right away. He thought about it. He thought about all the people in all the buildings and hangars and facilities who had things to say and reasons to believe those things wouldn't be heard, and so said nothing, and how the silence accumulated and became the environment that everyone ended up working in. Next time, Logan said, say it anyway. Ricky nodded. He didn't say anything else. He just stood there for a while, which Logan appreciated more than words. At 11:20, two men in suits Logan didn't recognize came into the hangar from the administrative wing. One of them was on a phone. They went directly to Richard Bale and spoke to him for approximately 3 minutes. Richard Bale's expression during this conversation moved through several stages, none of them comfortable. At 11:45, the event was formally called off. No announcement, no explanation given to the guests. The PR team simply began circulating through the crowd with the particular choreography of people trying to end something gracefully that has already ended badly, offering to arrange car service, promising follow-up communications, steering people gently but persistently toward the exit. The string quartet packed up. The champagne trays disappeared. The KA Sovereign sat in the center of the hangar under its event lights, gleaming, perfect-looking, entirely grounded. Logan finished his inspection notes. He organized his reports folder on his laptop. Everything time-stamped, everything backed up. He sent a brief encrypted email to his personal account containing links to all 4 reports and his certification refusal documentation. Then he closed his laptop. He thought about calling Sophie's school just to hear her voice. He didn't. School was in session and she'd think something was wrong. Nothing was wrong. Nothing that hadn't already been wrong for 6 weeks. He gathered his things. He signed out on the technician log near the side exit. He walked out of Hangar 7 into the April morning, which was cool and smelled faintly of jet fuel and the distant suggestion of rain. In the parking lot, he sat in his truck for a while. Not 40 minutes, like the day he got the call about Maya. Just a few minutes. Long enough to let the adrenaline settle into something quieter. He thought about what Amelia Kensington had said from that stage. The $599 comment, the room laughing, the way it had felt. Not devastating exactly, because he'd had 4 weeks to prepare for the possibility that something like this might happen. More like a confirmation, the shape of a thing you'd suspected but hoped you were wrong about. He wasn't angry, that was the honest answer, and he was always honest with himself, even when it was inconvenient. He wasn't angry, he was tired. He was tired in the particular way you get tired when you've been trying to get people to listen to something important, and the people with the authority to act have been using that authority to not hear you, and you've been doing it all while coming home every night to a 7-year-old who needed help with second-grade math and had opinions about Jupiter's moon hoarding behavior. He was tired, but he had done what he needed to do. He started the truck. He had a few hours before the school pickup. He was going to go home, make coffee that was actually hot, and sit at the kitchen table where Sophie had left her solar system worksheet from last night, and he was going to read through it and be ready to talk about Jupiter's 95 moons when she walked in the door. That was what he was going to do. The KA Sovereign could wait. It wasn't going anywhere. Not without his signature. The call came at 2:14 in the afternoon. Logan was at the kitchen table when his phone buzzed. Not the school, not Sophie's teacher, which was the first thing he always checked when an unknown number came through during school hours. It was a 703 area code he didn't recognize. He let it ring twice before picking up. Mr. Carter? The voice was male, professional, with the particular flatness of someone who had been trained to communicate without inflection. My name is Douglas Hale. I'm the Regional Compliance Officer for the FAA's Eastern District Aviation Safety Division. I'd like to speak with you about the KA Sovereign. Logan set down his coffee. All right. We received an automated flag from the Kensington Aviation Maintenance Tracking System this morning. Your certification refusal was logged at 6:04 a.m. A pause. We also received, through other channels, some footage from the event. Logan didn't ask what other channels. He already knew. The financial news crew had been rolling. The Aviation Week reporter had a recorder up. In the age of smartphones and immediate uploads, other channels meant the footage had been somewhere on the internet within the hour. "I want to be upfront with you," Douglas Hale said. "We're opening a preliminary inquiry. That's standard when we receive a certification refusal of this nature. I'd like you to come in Thursday morning and walk us through your reports." "I can do that," Logan said. "Bring everything, physical copies if you have them, and I'll need the access credentials for your entries in the maintenance tracking system." "Already prepared." Another pause, shorter this time, with a slightly different quality. "Mr. Carter, the footage from this morning. Did you intend to make that public statement?" Logan thought about the question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer. "I intended to be honest," he said. Whether that was public or private depended on whether anyone was willing to have a private conversation first. Douglas Hale was quiet for a moment. "I see." He didn't say it with judgment. He said it the way people say things when they're filing the information somewhere accurate. "Thursday at 8, our regional office on Westfield Avenue. I'll be there." Logan hung up and sat with the phone in his hand for a minute. Outside the kitchen window, the maple tree in the backyard was doing what it always did in April, putting out new growth at the tips of branches, small and yellow-green and tentative, the way beginnings always were. He had 3 hours before Sophie got out of school. He used them to organize everything. Not because Douglas Hale had asked, he was already organized, but because doing the thing thoroughly was the only way he knew how to do things. He printed physical copies of all 4 reports. He created a labeled folder with the photographs, the timestamps, the email chains, the system records. He wrote a 2-page summary of the timeline in plain language, the kind that didn't assume the reader had technical background, because the people he'd be talking to on Thursday would be investigators, not technicians. He was on page 2 when his phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from a number he recognized. Dale Pruitt. "We need to talk, not over the phone. Can you meet me?" Logan stared at it. Dale had been his supervisor for 6 years. In 6 years, Dale had never asked to meet off the books. Dale was a company man in the truest sense. Not out of cowardice exactly, but out of the particular loyalty that develops when you've given 2 decades to something and it's given you a stable salary and a sense of purpose in return. Dale didn't go around the company. He went through it, or he waited. Logan typed back, "When and where?" The response came in 30 seconds. Coffee place on Harmon Street, the one near the airport, 4:30. Logan dropped Sophie at her after-school program with Mrs. Delgado next door. Sophie barely looked up from a book about dwarf planets, which she had developed strong opinions about, and drove to Harmon Street. The coffee place was the kind that had been there long enough to be comfortable. Worn upholstered chairs, acoustic tile ceiling, the permanent smell of dark roast and something baked that morning. Dale was already there when Logan arrived, sitting in a corner booth with his hands wrapped around a mug and the expression of a man who hadn't slept well. Dale was 53. He had the build of someone who had been athletic in his 30s and had transitioned into something softer without fully noticing. He had a good face, honest lines, the kind of weathering that came from years of fluorescent light and jet fuel smell and real work. Logan respected him, even now, even after the hand on his arm in the hangar. "Thanks for coming," Dale said. Logan sat down. A server appeared and he ordered black coffee without looking at the menu. When she left, he looked at Dale and waited. Dale wrapped his hands tighter around his mug. "I want to tell you something, and I need you to understand that I'm telling you as someone who... I'm telling you as Dale, not as your supervisor, not as a Kensington employee, just as Dale." "Okay," Logan said. "I knew you were right." Dale said it quietly, looking at his coffee. "About the aileron. I knew from your first report. I've been doing this long enough that I could read what you wrote and understand what it meant, and I knew you were right." Logan didn't say anything. "I took it to Richard," Dale continued. "That part I told you. But I also... Richard took it to someone above him, and the message that came back down was that the launch timeline was fixed, and that the engineering team's sign-off was sufficient, and that your concerns were being noted, and I..." He stopped. He pressed his lips together. "I passed that message down to you, and I told myself that was the right thing, Because the engineers had signed off and I was a supervisor, not a structural analyst. And who was I to— Dale. I know. He exhaled through his nose. I know what I did. What happened to the reports I sent to Richard Bale? Dale looked at him then. They were put in the system, so they're there. But Richard also sent a note to the engineering team flagging that you might continue to raise concerns, and their formal response was filed as a counter-assessment. It's in the system too. It essentially says that your findings were reviewed and determined to be within acceptable parameters. Who signed that counter-assessment? Phil Warren. Logan thought about Phil Warren. Phil was a senior engineer, 10 years at Kensington, reliable, smart, the kind of man who filled out forms correctly and hit his deadlines and didn't make waves. Phil Warren was also, Logan had suspected for some time, the kind of engineer who was better at documentation than at actually crawling into the mechanical spaces where the real information lived. Did Phil Warren physically inspect the aileron assembly? Logan asked. Dale looked at him steadily. No, he reviewed your photographs and your written assessment and wrote his counter from the desk. Logan absorbed this. Okay. Logan, the FAA is going to find that counter assessment. They're going to see that there was an engineering sign-off. They're going to find 4 reports submitted over 6 weeks, none of which resulted in a physical secondary inspection, Logan said. And they're going to find my certification refusal. And they're going to find that I was publicly mocked at the event for raising those concerns. He paused. The counter-assessment is part of the record. So is everything else. Dale was quiet for a long time. The coffee place hummed around them, 2 women talking near the window, the sound of a steam wand, someone's phone playing music quietly. What do you need from me? Dale finally asked. Logan looked at him. He hadn't expected that question. He'd expected Dale to explain why he'd come, what he needed, what Logan could do to make this easier on the company, or on Dale, or on the situation in general. The straightforwardness of it landed differently. I need you to tell the truth, Logan said, to the FAA, to whoever asks. I need you to tell them exactly what you told me just now, that you received the reports, you escalated them, and the decision came back down to proceed without addressing the defect. Dale nodded slowly. I can do that. And I need you to know that I'm not trying to burn the company down, Logan said. I'm not trying to burn anyone down. I filed those reports because I didn't want someone to get hurt. That's the entire reason. Everything else is— He paused, searching for the word. Noise. Dale nodded again. He looked tired and a little smaller than he usually did, like the conversation had let some air out of him. Not in a bad way exactly, more like something that had been held too tight had been allowed to loosen. You have a daughter, Dale said suddenly. Not a question. Sophie, 7. Dale nodded. He had 2 grown kids of his own, Logan knew, both out of the house. She knows what you do for work? She knows I fix planes. She proud of you? Logan thought about Sophie and her solar system worksheet and her strong feelings about Jupiter. Yeah, he said. I think so. Dale wrapped his hands around his mug one more time, then set it down. Good, he said. That's good. They sat there for another 20 minutes, not talking much. Just 2 men in a coffee place on Harmon Street, working through the quiet aftermath of a day that had started badly and wasn't finished yet. The footage, it turned out, had traveled fast. By the time Logan picked up Sophie that evening and sat with her at the kitchen table going over her worksheet, Jupiter's moons were apparently even more numerous than Sophie had initially understood, which she found both impressive and suspicious. The video of the unveiling was circulating through aviation industry channels. Not viral exactly, not in the mainstream sense, but within the specific ecosystem of people who cared about aviation safety, it was moving. A clip of approximately 45 seconds had been cut from the financial news crew's footage. Amelia on the stage, the $599 comment, the laughter, and then, this was the part that people were stopping on, a wide shot of Logan standing at the edge of the crowd, not reacting, not performing offense, just standing there with his clipboard and his cold coffee while the room laughed around him. Something about that stillness read on camera in a way that was hard to look away from. Logan didn't watch it. He knew what had happened. He'd been there. What he did do after Sophie was in bed was call his sister in Baltimore. Claire was 40, 3 years older, worked as a nurse practitioner, had the particular combination of practical intelligence and emotional directness that their mother had possessed and that Logan had received a quieter version of. "I saw the video," Claire said, before he even said hello. "Yeah. That woman called you out by price in front of a room full of people." "She did. And you just stood there." "I did." A pause on Claire's end. "Logan, that must have felt terrible." He considered this honestly. "It didn't feel great," he admitted. "But I knew something they didn't know yet. It's hard to feel humiliated when you're holding information like that." Claire was quiet for a second. "What information?" "That she couldn't fly the plane without my signature." Another pause. Longer this time. Then Claire said, "Oh." And then, "Oh, Logan." "Yeah." So the whole time she was, the whole time. He could hear Claire processing this. She had a lawyer's sequential mind despite never having gone to law school. She worked through things in order, step by step, testing each piece before moving to the next. "Okay, and now?" FAA called. "I'm meeting with them Thursday. The investigation is open." "Are you going to get fired?" "Probably depends on how the next few weeks go." "Do you have a union?" "We have a collective agreement. I have a shop steward I should probably call." "Call him tonight," Claire said. Not a suggestion. "I will." "And eat something. You sound like you haven't eaten." He hadn't, actually. He'd been so focused on the paperwork and the Sophie routine and the call with Dale that dinner had happened in theory but not in practice. He found some leftover pasta in the refrigerator and ate it cold standing at the counter while Claire talked him through the practical considerations. Documentation, legal representation, what to say and not say to people at work in the coming days. Claire was good in a crisis. She always had been. When their mother got sick, Claire had been the one with the binder of doctor's contacts, and the medication schedule, and the questions pre-written for every appointment. Logan had been the one who showed up and sat with his mother and held her hand and didn't talk about the binder. They had divided the territory without ever discussing it, and it had worked. "One more thing," Claire said before she hung up. "The woman who did this to you, Amelia, whatever. Kensington. She's 30 years old and she just blew up her own company launch on camera. Whatever happens next, that's on her, not you. I know that. I need you to actually know it, not just say it." Logan was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the yard was dark. The maple tree was invisible, but he knew it was there. "I know it," he said. He called his shop steward, a woman named Patricia Okafor, who picked up on the second ring despite it being close to 9 at night, and spent 40 minutes on the phone going through the situation. Patricia was precise and calm and asked exactly the right questions, and by the end of the call, she had told him 3 things. Don't discuss the matter with management without her present, don't delete anything, and come see her Wednesday morning before the FAA meeting. Logan wrote those 3 things down, even though he would have remembered them. Writing things down was a habit. It made them more real, more fixed, more accountable. His whole professional life had been built on that habit, on the belief that if you put something on paper and signed your name to it, you were saying, "I was here. This happened. I saw it." He went to bed at 10:30. He lay in the dark and listened to the house. The particular sounds of Sophie sleeping 2 rooms over, the creak of the hallway when the heating settled, the distant sound of a plane somewhere above, climbing into the dark. He wondered if whoever was on that plane had thought about the maintenance technicians who'd spent time on it. He suspected most people didn't. Not because they didn't care, but because caring about something you couldn't see required a specific kind of effort, and there were only so many things a person could hold in their attention at once. He thought about Amelia Kensington. He tried to think about her honestly, without the filter of what had happened in the hangar. She was 30 years old. She'd built something real and significant. The ambition required for that was not small. It was enormous, the kind that ate sleep and relationships and weekends, that demanded you believe in yourself past the point where most people would have stopped. He could respect that even while understanding that the same force driving her success had also made her blind to the specific people who made that success possible. He didn't hate her, That was the honest answer. He was tired of explaining that, even just to himself, because it sounded like something a person says to sound noble. But it was simply true. Hating her required energy he didn't have and wouldn't have changed a single fastener point on a starboard aileron assembly. He fell asleep with the light off and the house quiet, and his folder of documentation sitting on the kitchen table, organized and complete and ready for Thursday. The investigation moved faster than Logan expected. He'd been through FAA processes before, most experienced technicians had, one way or another. And they were typically measured affairs, deliberate and procedurally careful in the way that regulatory bodies tended to be when they understood that their job was to be right rather than fast. But the KA sovereign situation had the particular momentum of things that happen in public, with cameras, in front of people who immediately started asking questions. The Thursday morning meeting with Douglas Hale lasted 3 hours. Logan sat across a conference table from Hale and 2 other investigators, a woman named Chen who handled structural engineering assessments, and a quiet man named Torres who mostly took notes but asked very precise questions when he did speak, and walked them through the entire timeline. Every report, every response, every follow-up. The photographs of Fastener Point 11, his assessment of the structural stress implications, the counter-assessment from Phil Warren, the email from Dale, the event. Chen asked to examine his photographic documentation closely. She pulled up something on her laptop and compared it side by side with a technical schematic that Logan recognized as the manufacturer's design spec for the KA Sovereign aileron assembly. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said to Hale rather than Logan, "I want to do a physical inspection of the aircraft." Hale nodded. He looked at Logan. "Mr. Carter, in your professional assessment, the defect you identified, best and worst case." Logan thought about how to answer that accurately. Best case, it's a manufacturing irregularity that never presents under normal flight conditions, and the aircraft flies for years without incident. Worst case, under sustained high-speed flight with significant atmospheric stress, the assembly experiences progressive failure and the pilot loses aileron control on the starboard side. He paused. That's not unsurvivable, but it's also not a situation anyone wants to manage at altitude. Chen and Hale exchanged a look that told Logan everything he needed to know about how seriously they were taking it. He drove home from that meeting with the windows down despite the April chill, because the conference room had been warm and close, and he needed the air. He was 2 blocks from home when his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. He almost didn't answer. He answered. "Mr. Carter, this is Evan Mercer. I'm an attorney with Schaefer Mercer. We represent several of the institutional investors in the Kensington Aviation KA Sovereign project." The voice was measured, careful. "I'm reaching out because my clients have become aware of the circumstances surrounding the unveiling, and we have some questions about the maintenance documentation." Logan pulled over. "You should contact my shop steward, Patricia Okafor. I'm not discussing specifics with anyone outside the FAA investigation without her involvement." A brief pause. "Of course. Completely understood. I simply wanted to make direct contact and let you know that my clients are taking this matter very seriously." "I appreciate that," Logan said. "Mr. Carter, one question, if you'll allow. This is not about the specifics of the defect or the documentation. I simply want to understand. In your professional judgment, should that aircraft have flown today?" Logan looked out the windshield at a residential street in April, someone walking a large brown dog on the sidewalk, a sprinkler starting up on a lawn 2 houses down. "No," he said. "It should not have." Another pause. "Thank you for your time." Logan hung up and sat for a minute. The sprinkler was going in small arcs across the lawn. The dog had stopped to investigate something in the grass with the total commitment that dogs brought to investigating things. He thought about the investors. He thought about how this worked, how the chain of accountability moved outward from a single technical report, finding its way into boardrooms and legal offices and regulatory hearings, spreading through the circulatory system of a business until the original source of it, a technician's note about a fastener point, became both very small and enormously important simultaneously. He had known this was how it would go. He'd known it from the day he filed the first report, and nothing happened. You don't get ignored 4 times without understanding that ignoring something doesn't make it go away. It just changes where the consequences land. What he hadn't fully anticipated was the speed. By Friday, two things happened in the same afternoon. The FAA's physical inspection team arrived at Kensington Aviation's maintenance facility and took formal custody of the KA Sovereign for inspection. And a reporter from a national financial outlet called Kensington Aviation's PR office with a list of questions that included the phrase maintenance records indicating ignored safety warnings. The PR office had no comment. That no comment became a paragraph in a story that ran Saturday morning. Logan read it at his kitchen table with Sophie sitting across from him eating cereal and telling him about a disagreement she'd had with a classmate named Marcus about whether Pluto should be a planet again. He thinks it should be, Sophie said, but Pluto doesn't have orbital dominance, So, Logan agreed, you can't just want something to be true and have it be true. She pointed her spoon at him with the particular authority of a 7-year-old who has researched something. It has to actually be true. Logan looked at his daughter. He thought about Phil Warren's counter-assessment written from a desk without a physical inspection. He thought about acceptable parameters and calibration variants and launch timelines. That's right, he said. You can't. Sophie seemed satisfied with this and returned to her cereal. Logan turned back to the article on his phone. His name appeared in the third paragraph. Senior Maintenance Specialist Logan Carter, whose 4 safety reports were reportedly dismissed by company management in the weeks before the event. The word reportedly was doing a lot of work in that sentence, but the rest of it was accurate. His phone started buzzing before he finished reading. He turned it face down on the table. Whatever it was could wait 20 minutes while he had breakfast with his daughter. Sophie looked at his phone and then at him. Is something happening? She asked. Yeah, he said. Some work stuff. Is it about the plane you wouldn't sign? He looked at her. How do you know about that? Mrs. Delgado said something. I heard her on the phone last night when you were getting my bag. Logan filed this under the category of things that happen when you live in a world connected by phones and the internet and neighbors who listen to the news. Yeah, he said. It's about that. Sophie ate her cereal thoughtfully. You did the right thing, she said, without looking up. How do you know? Because you always do. She said it simply, not like a compliment, more like a statement of observed fact, the way she might say the sky was blue. Logan looked at the table. He felt something shift behind his sternum, not quite the hard thing it usually was, but softer, more like the difference between a fist and an open hand. Finish your cereal, he said. I know. The thing about a public incident of this nature, Logan would come to understand this more fully in the weeks ahead, though he was already beginning to understand it now, was that it had a center of gravity. The original event pulled everything toward itself. Every piece of information, every person who'd been near it, every decision that had been made before it, all of it began moving in that direction, as if the moment in the hangar had created a kind of organizational black hole that rearranged the orbit of everything around it. Employees at Kensington Aviation who had been silent for months, who had noticed things, heard things, felt uncomfortable about things, and said nothing because saying something felt risky in the specific way it always felt risky when you needed your job, started coming forward. Not all at once, not dramatically. One at a time, mostly, through the indirect channels that people use when they want to be honest but are still afraid. Patricia Okafor called Logan on Saturday afternoon with an update. 2 other technicians had submitted formal statements to the FAA investigation that corroborated Logan's timeline. A third, someone in the administrative wing, whose name Patricia didn't share, had provided documentation of internal emails that discussed the launch timeline in ways that were going to be difficult for Kensington Aviation's leadership to explain. This is moving fast, Patricia said. She was matter-of-fact about it, not excited. The way someone is matter-of-fact when they've seen situations like this before and know that speed is not the same as resolution. Have you talked to anyone from the company since Thursday? Dale texted once. I didn't respond. Keep it that way for now. Anyone from Kensington's legal team reaches out, I tell them to call you. Good. A pause. Logan, you should know there's a possibility that this goes in a direction that makes your employment there untenable regardless of outcome. I know. Are you prepared for that? He thought about Sophie's cereal bowl, her opinion on Pluto, the way she'd said you always do without looking up. He thought about the maple tree putting out new growth. He thought about the folder on his kitchen table. "Yeah," he said, "I'm prepared." There was a quiet on Patricia's end that wasn't empty. It was the quiet of someone who'd worked union advocacy long enough to know the difference between people who said they were prepared and people who actually were. "All right," she said. "I'll be in touch Monday." He spent the rest of the weekend doing the ordinary things. Grocery shopping with Sophie, who had opinions about which crackers were acceptable and which were not. Fixing the stuck drawer in the bathroom that had been stuck for 3 weeks. Sitting in the backyard on Sunday afternoon while Sophie drew a map of the solar system in chalk on the concrete patio, complete with labels and a legend explaining why Pluto had been incorrectly demoted. He watched her work on it, the concentration on her face, the precise lettering for someone who was 7, the way she stood back periodically and assessed the whole thing before going back in with a different color chalk. And he thought about Maya. He did that sometimes. Let himself think about her directly instead of around her. It still hurt in the way that things hurt when they're permanent. But there was something else in it now, too. Something that had developed slowly over 4 years that he couldn't fully name, more like gratitude than grief. Or maybe gratitude inside grief, the way you could appreciate light without pretending the dark wasn't there. Maya would have had something to say about the Ka sovereign. She'd been a high school history teacher, and she'd had a particular gift for connecting what happened in rooms to what happened in the world afterward. How small decisions made by ordinary people in ordinary moments became the hinge points that everything else swung on. She would have said something sharp, and probably funny, about Amelia Kensington's $599 comment, and then she would have said something serious about what it meant that Logan had done what he did anyway. He missed her in the specific way you miss people when something happens that they would have understood completely. Sophie looked up from her chalk work. "Do you think they're going to fix the plane?" she asked. "Yeah," Logan said. "I think they're going to fix the plane." "Good." She went back to her legend. "Because if they don't and it crashes, that's on them, not you." Logan looked at the back of her head, 7 years old, with her mother's eyes and her mother's way of going straight to the center of a thing. "That's right," he said. "That's exactly right." The maple tree moved in the late afternoon wind. Sophie kept coloring. Somewhere above them, invisible and routine and trusted by the hundreds of people inside it, another plane crossed the sky. The Monday after the weekend felt different in the way that Mondays feel different when something has shifted and the shift hasn't fully settled yet. Logan drove to Kensington Aviation's facility the same way he always did. Route 9 to Meridian Parkway, left on Hangar Road, past the fuel depot and the cargo building and the long chain-link fence with the company logo stenciled every 40 feet in navy and silver. He'd done this drive so many times over 11 years that his hands did it without consultation from the rest of him. But today he was aware of it. The way you become aware of automatic things when the context around them changes. Patricia Okafor met him in the parking lot. She was a compact woman in her late 40s, natural hair cut short, always wore a blazer regardless of the temperature because she said it made people take her more seriously in rooms where she was often the only black woman present. She had a tote bag over one shoulder and the expression of someone who had already been thinking for several hours. "Before you go in," she said, "I need you to know that Richard Bale requested a meeting with you this morning. I've already responded that any meeting with management happens with me present. They've agreed to that. It's at 10. What do they want?" "I don't know yet, but I want you to let me lead until I signal otherwise." She looked at him steadily. "Can you do that?" "Yes." "If they say something that requires a technical correction, something factually wrong about the maintenance records, correct it, clearly and briefly. Otherwise, you listen." He nodded. They walked in together. The facility felt quieter than usual, not empty. People were working, the floor crew was present, the administrative wing had its usual hum of activity. But there was a texture to the quiet that Logan recognized. It was the quiet of people who were watching without appearing to watch, of colleagues who had things to say to each other that they weren't saying out loud because they weren't sure yet which way the current was running. Ricky Soto caught Logan's eye from across the floor and gave him a single brief nod. Logan returned it. Dale Pruitt was not on the floor. Logan noticed this without commenting on it. The meeting with Richard Bale was in a second-floor conference room, the one with the long table and the glass wall overlooking the tarmac, where you could see aircraft moving in and out of the service bays below. Logan had been in this room twice before, once for his performance review 3 years ago, and once for a department safety briefing following a minor incident with a fuel line coupling on a different aircraft. Richard Bale was already seated when they arrived. He was 58, silver-haired, wore his authority the way men of his generation often did, as if it were simply the natural state of things rather than something conferred. Beside him sat a woman Logan hadn't met, younger, with the specific energy of someone whose job was to manage exactly this kind of conversation. Company legal, Logan guessed. Introductions were brief. The woman was named Sandra Marsh, and she was indeed from Kensington Aviation's legal team. Patricia set her tote bag on the table. "We appreciate the meeting," she said pleasantly. "What did you want to discuss?" Richard Bale looked at Logan rather than Patricia. "Logan, I want to start by acknowledging that the situation at the unveiling was handled poorly. That's not in question." Logan waited. "What I'd like to discuss is the path forward. The FAA inspection is underway. We're cooperating fully. The company is committed to addressing whatever findings come out of that process." Richard paused. "What I need to understand is your current position." Patricia said, "Could you be more specific about what you mean by position?" Sandra Marsh leaned forward slightly. "We want to understand whether Mr. Carter intends to cooperate with the FAA investigation, and in what capacity." Patricia looked at her calmly. "Mr. Carter has already met with the FAA investigation team and provided full documentation. He intends to continue cooperating completely." She paused. "Is there something specific about that cooperation that concerns you?" Sandra Marsh had the expression of someone choosing words carefully. "We want to ensure that any statements made to investigators are confined to the factual record of Mr. Carter's direct observations and documentation." The room was quiet for a moment. Logan understood what she was saying. She was asking politely and with complete deniability whether Logan intended to editorialize, whether he intended to say things like, "I believe this was a systemic failure," or management prioritized the timeline over safety, characterizations that went beyond documentation and entered interpretation. Patricia was already opening her mouth, so Logan stayed quiet. "Mr. Carter's statements to the FAA will be honest and accurate," Patricia said. "I think that covers the scope of your question." Sandra Marsh made a small note on the legal pad in front of her. Richard Bale shifted in his seat. He looked at Logan again. "I also want you to know that your employment status is not in question. Whatever the outcome of the investigation, Kensington Aviation has no intention of—" "Richard!" Logan spoke for the first time since the introductions. Patricia glanced at him, but didn't stop him. "I appreciate that. But I want to be honest with you about something." He kept his voice the same, even register it always was. "I filed 4 reports for 6 weeks, and the response to those reports was to proceed with the launch and then have me publicly characterized as a minor inconvenience at a company event." He paused. "Telling me my employment is secure feels a little bit like the wrong thing to be focused on right now." The room was quiet. Richard Bale looked at him for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not defensiveness exactly, more like the particular discomfort of a man who is accustomed to managing situations and had just been reminded that some situations don't want to be managed. "You're right," Richard said, which was not what Logan had expected. He said it quietly, without the prepackaged quality of a prepared statement. Just 2 words. Flatly honest. Sandra Marsh looked at her legal pad with the expression of someone who wished he hadn't said that, at least not in a room with a witness. "The decision to proceed was mine," Richard said. "Not entirely. There were people above me involved, but on this floor, it was mine. And I—" He stopped. He straightened his pen on the table, a small, uncomfortable gesture. "I made the wrong call." Patricia was very still beside Logan, which Logan recognized as her version of not reacting visibly to something unexpected. Logan looked at Richard Bale. He thought about what it cost a man like that to say something like that. Not nothing. It wasn't nothing. I know that wasn't easy to say, Logan said, but it needs to be part of the record, not just said in this room. Sandra Marsh said carefully, any statements made regarding decision-making processes would need to be, Sandra, Richard cut her off, gently but definitively. I'll handle this. Sandra closed her legal pad. I understand what you're asking, Richard said to Logan, and I'll address it with the investigators directly. Logan nodded once. That's all I'm asking. The meeting ended 15 minutes later without resolution of anything in particular, but with the particular atmosphere of a room where the floor has shifted under everyone's feet and nobody is quite sure what the new footing looks like. Patricia walked with Logan to the stairwell before speaking. That went differently than I expected, she said. Yeah. Bale's statement about the decision, if he repeats that to the FAA, it changes the shape of the investigation significantly. I know. She looked at him. How are you doing? He thought about it honestly. I'm okay, he said. I'm tired, but I'm okay. She nodded. She believed him, he thought, which meant he probably looked it. He didn't feel it entirely, but okay was a territory with wide borders, and he was somewhere inside them. The FAA physical inspection of the KA Sovereign took 4 days. Logan was not part of the inspection team, that was investigators and independent structural analysts, but he was called twice during the week to answer follow-up questions, once by phone and once in person. Chen, the structural engineering investigator, was the one who called both times. She had a precise, unsentimental way of asking questions that Logan respected. She didn't ask him what he thought. She asked what he observed, what he measured, what he documented. She treated his reports as evidence rather than opinion, which was exactly what they were. On the Thursday of that week, 12 days after the unveiling, the FAA issued a preliminary finding. Logan read it on his phone standing in the Kensington Aviation parking lot, having just come off a shift on a different aircraft that had nothing to do with any of this. The preliminary finding confirmed the manufacturing defect in the KA Sovereign's starboard aileron assembly, confirmed that the defect had been identified and documented in maintenance reports submitted 6 weeks prior to the unveiling, confirmed that no physical secondary inspection had been conducted prior to the event. The finding did not yet assign fault or recommend penalties. That would come in the full report, which was weeks away. But it stated, in the flat regulatory language that the FAA used, that the aircraft had not been in an airworthy condition on the date of the unveiling, and that the certification refusal submitted by senior maintenance specialist Logan Carter had been procedurally and technically correct. He read it twice. Then he put his phone in his pocket and stood in the parking lot for a moment, looking at the sky above the airport. He had known he was right. He had known it the way you know things when you've been doing work long enough that your hands and your instincts and your training have fused into a single instrument. But knowing you're right and having it confirmed in a federal document are two different experiences, and he'd be dishonest if he said the confirmation didn't matter. It did. Not because it changed anything about the original decision, he'd have made the same call regardless, but because it meant the record was clear. It meant the timestamps, and the reports, and the photographs, and the words. This aircraft is not currently certified for flight operations, existed in the official history of this event, and couldn't be rewritten. That mattered, for him and for every technician who'd ever filed a report that disappeared into the system. His phone buzzed. Patricia. You've seen the preliminary finding? He typed back, yes. Patricia. Press is going to pick this up by end of day. Do not make any statements. Media inquiries come to me. Logan. Understood. He went back inside to finish his shift. The press did pick it up by end of day. By Friday morning, it had moved from aviation trade publications to mainstream business outlets. The story had a clean narrative line that journalists understood instinctively. The lone technician, the ignored warnings, the public humiliation, the grounded jet, the federal confirmation. It had a villain and a protagonist and a structural defect that served as a physical metaphor for organizational failure. It was, in the language of people who thought about these things, a story that told itself. Logan did not read most of the coverage. He read enough to know what was being said, and he trusted Patricia to monitor it for anything that required a response, and then he did his job and went home to Sophie. But the coverage existed, and it was doing something beyond just informing people. It was pulling things toward the surface. By the end of that first week following the preliminary finding, 3 more Kensington Aviation employees had submitted formal statements to the FAA investigation. Not technicians this time. 2 of them were from the engineering department, and 1 was an administrative coordinator who had been present in internal meetings where the KA sovereign timeline had been discussed. Logan learned this from Patricia, who learned it from the FAA investigator, who disclosed it as a matter of record. He didn't know the details of what those statements contained, but Patricia told him, in her matter-of-fact way, that the investigation had expanded its scope to include Kensington Aviation's internal safety decision-making processes over the previous 18 months. 18 months. That was longer than the 6 weeks of the KA Sovereign issue, which meant whatever those employees had said extended beyond this specific aircraft. Logan sat with that for a while. He thought about the particular weight of people deciding to speak, the calculation that had to happen, the fear on one side, the need to be honest on the other, and somewhere in the middle, the tipping point where one outweighed the other. He thought about Ricky Soto standing at the workbench saying, "I didn't think anyone would listen to me, and if they weren't listening to you, they definitely weren't listening to me." He hoped Ricky was okay. He texted him, just checking in. "You all right?" And Ricky texted back 15 minutes later, "Yeah, I actually put in a statement. Figured it was time." Then, a second later, "You said to say it anyway." Logan read that twice and didn't respond immediately. He set his phone on the kitchen counter and looked out the window. The maple tree was fuller now. The new growth from April had filled in, the tree doing what trees did, adding to itself steadily and without fanfare. He texted back, "Good. That took guts." Ricky. Learned from somewhere. The weeks that followed had a quality that Logan would later struggle to describe accurately, because from the outside they probably looked like events unfolding with a certain momentum, the investigation progressing, the media coverage cycling, the Kensington Aviation Board meeting in emergency session, the investors talking to their lawyers, Amelia Kensington's name appearing in every story with language like under scrutiny and facing calls for accountability. From the outside, it probably looked like something collapsing in a fairly dramatic way. From the inside, from Logan's particular inside, it felt more granular than that, more like the daily experience of a person who has done the thing they needed to do and is now living in the aftermath, which is quieter and stranger and more complicated than the moment of the thing itself. He went to work. He did his job. He inspected aircraft, not the KA Sovereign, which remained in FAA custody, but the rest of the fleet, the ordinary maintenance cycle that continued regardless of investigations and press coverage and board meetings. He filed his reports with the same detail and the same timestamps he always had, because he wasn't capable of doing that differently. He picked up Sophie from school, he made dinner, he helped her with homework, he listened to her theories about the solar system. One evening, she asked him if he was famous now. He was washing dishes when she said it, and he almost dropped the pot he was holding. "What?" "Marcus at school said his dad saw your name on the news." She was sitting at the kitchen table coloring something. "He said you were famous." "I'm not famous," Logan said. "Marcus says you're a hero." Marcus's dad should probably find different things to watch. Sophie looked up from her coloring. "Are you embarrassed?" He thought about it. "A little," he admitted. "Why? You did a good thing." "Good things don't always feel comfortable afterward," he said. "That's kind of the thing about them." Sophie appeared to consider this with the seriousness she brought to most things. "That seems unfair," she said. "Yeah, it kind of is." She went back to her coloring. A minute later, she said without looking up, "I told Marcus you weren't a hero. I said you were just a person who did his job." Logan looked at the back of her head. "Thank you," he said. He said that's basically the same thing. "Smart kid," Logan said. Sophie shrugged. "He's still wrong about Pluto." The board meeting happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the preliminary finding. Logan knew about it because Patricia had sources, and Patricia kept him informed of things he needed to know. The Kensington Aviation Board convened an emergency session to address the investigation, the investor concerns, and what one board member had apparently described in an internal email, which had been obtained by someone, somehow, and quoted in a financial outlet as a catastrophic failure of internal accountability. What happened in that meeting, Logan learned secondhand and in pieces, and he was never entirely sure how accurately any of it filtered out. What he understood was this: the board had demanded a full accounting from senior leadership, including Richard Bale and the engineering department heads. Richard Bale, apparently consistent with what he'd said in the second-floor conference room 12 days prior, did not attempt to reframe the decision-making. He told the board what had happened in essentially the same terms he'd told Logan, that the decision to proceed had moved through the chain of command, that concerns had been acknowledged rather than addressed, and that the outcome was his responsibility. Sandra Marsh must have had a difficult few days. Amelia Kensington did not attend the board meeting. That detail appeared in the financial press as a noteworthy absence, with speculation about what it signified. Logan didn't speculate. He didn't know what it meant and wasn't in a position to know, and he'd spent too many years around machinery to trust the kind of conclusions that came from insufficient data. What he did know was that the story about Amelia was more complicated than the version the media was running. The media needed a clear face for the failure, someone to put in the frame. Amelia was 30 years old and had made a $599 joke on camera while ignoring safety warnings, so she was the natural candidate. Logan understood that, but he also understood, having spent 11 years in the industry, that the decisions that led to the KA Sovereign situation had not been made by one person alone. They had been made by a system, a culture of timeline pressure and risk tolerance, and the particular organizational blindness that develops when everyone in a building has quietly agreed that certain things won't be questioned because questioning them would create friction, and friction would slow things down. Amelia had been part of that system, but she hadn't built it by herself. He mentioned this to Claire during their weekly phone call. Claire listened and then said, "You're being very generous to someone who called you out by price in front of a room full of people." "I'm being accurate," Logan said. "That's different from generous." "Logan, she humiliated you." "I know that." He was quiet for a second. "But I don't think she's the only problem. And if the investigation only fixes the face it can put in the frame, the next Kensington Aviation is already being built somewhere by someone who hasn't made the specific mistake of doing it on camera yet." Claire was quiet for a moment. Then, "You ever think about going into policy?" "No." "You should. You have this incredibly irritating ability to be fair to people who don't deserve it." "Is that a compliment?" "I genuinely don't know," she said. He smiled. It was the real kind, the chest kind, the Sophie kind. What Logan didn't anticipate, and nobody really warned him about, was what happened to the inside of a workplace when an investigation was running and everyone was waiting and things were structurally uncertain, but daily life continued anyway. The floor of Kensington Aviation's maintenance facility in those weeks had a particular atmosphere. Colleagues he'd known for years were navigating the situation differently. Some came to him directly, quietly, at the workbench, away from the obvious sightlines of anyone from management, and told him they were glad he'd done what he did. A few of those conversations were short and a little awkward, like people who had things to say but weren't sure how much of it was appropriate to say out loud. Some colleagues kept their distance, not hostile, just careful, the way people are careful when they're watching which way a situation resolves before they decide how they feel about the people involved. One person was actively hostile. His name was Frank DeLuca, a maintenance technician who'd been with the company for 15 years and had a complicated loyalty to Richard Bale that Logan had never quite understood. Frank didn't say anything directly. He was too careful for that, but he made his position known through the smaller instruments of workplace antagonism. The conversation that stopped when Logan entered the break room. The work request that sat in the queue longer than it should have. The pointed comment in a group setting about how some people confuse doing the right thing with grandstanding. Logan let it go. He let it go not because it didn't register, it did, but because engaging with it was a bad use of energy, and because Frank's feelings about the situation were not something Logan could control or was responsible for managing. What he couldn't let go was a conversation that happened on a Thursday afternoon near the end of a shift in the corridor outside the tool storage room. Dale Pruitt found him. Dale looked like he hadn't been sleeping well. The particular hollowing around the eyes and mouth that accumulates when sleep is short and the mind keeps running regardless. He'd been out of Logan's direct orbit since the Monday meeting with Richard Bale, navigating his own version of the aftermath. "Logan?" He fell into step beside him. "Can I—" "Just a minute." "Yeah." They walked to the side corridor that led to the back exit, which was typically empty at shift change. Dale stopped. He put his hands in his pockets, the gesture of a man organizing himself. "I talked to the FAA investigators Tuesday," Dale said. "I told them what I told you at the coffee place. Everything." Logan looked at him. "How'd that go?" Dale made a face. "About how you'd expect." He paused. "They were professional. They listened. They asked a lot of questions." He pressed his lips together. "Some of those questions were about specific emails between me and Richard, about specific decisions, about the timeline between receiving your reports and the formal counter-assessment from Phil Warren." "Okay." "I answered them, honestly." Dale looked at the floor and then back up. "I don't know what that means for me professionally. Sandra Marsh made some noises about the scope of my individual responsibility versus the department's collective decision-making process, which I think is lawyer language for trying to figure out where they can put the thing without it going somewhere expensive." Logan was quiet. "I'm not telling you this because I want something from you," Dale said, with the particular care of someone who needs the distinction to be clear. "I'm telling you because I said I'd be honest, and I want you to know I followed through on that." "I know you did," Logan said. "I appreciate it." Dale nodded. He was quiet for a moment, then, "My youngest, she's 23. She's studying aerospace engineering. Did I ever tell you that?" "No." "She wants to work in commercial aviation. She's good, smart. Better than me at 23, I can say that without any. She's genuinely good." He paused. "When this whole thing started, when I saw that footage from the hangar and then read your reports again, I kept thinking about her, about the industry she's going to be working in, whether it's going to be the kind of place where if she finds something wrong, somebody listens." Logan looked at him. "I made the wrong call," Dale said. "I know that. I've known that since the first report you submitted. He stopped. "I talked myself into believing the engineers had it, that it wasn't my place to push harder than I did. And that was—" He exhaled. "It was easier to believe that." "Dale," Logan kept his voice level, without judgment in it, "you told the truth when it mattered. That's not nothing." "It should have been earlier." "Yes, it should have been." The honesty of that sat between them for a moment, uncomfortable and necessary. Not an accusation, just a fact. The kind of fact that doesn't get better from being softened. Dale nodded slowly. "Yeah." He straightened. "Okay, I just wanted you to know." He walked back toward the main floor. Logan watched him go, then pushed through the back exit into the afternoon, where the air smelled like jet fuel and the western sky had gone the particular copper color it got before it transitioned to evening. He thought about Dale's daughter studying aerospace engineering. He thought about what the industry would look like for her, what it could look like if the things that happened in investigations like this one changed the culture in the specific places where culture actually lived, which was not in policy documents, but in the daily decisions that people made when they were tired and there was pressure and it was easier to move on. That was the thing. It was always easier to move on. The investigation's full report came out on a Thursday morning, 41 days after the unveiling. Logan was at home. He'd requested the day off weeks earlier, partly because he'd known it was coming, and partly because he needed to be somewhere that was his. The Kensington Aviation facility was not somewhere that was his right now. His kitchen table was. He read the full report on his laptop with a second cup of coffee and Sophie's remaining chalk solar system visible through the back window, faded but still legible. She'd been insisting for a week that it wasn't supposed to be washed away because it was a scientific document, and Logan had been allowing this because it seemed worth preserving. The report ran to 47 pages. Logan read every page. It confirmed everything in the preliminary finding and went further. The manufacturing defect was classified as a Category B structural anomaly, not immediately dangerous under normal conditions, but unacceptable for flight certification under FAA airworthiness standards. The report stated explicitly that the decision to proceed with the unveiling without addressing Logan's reports constituted a failure of the company's internal safety management system. Phil Warren's counter-assessment was found to be procedurally inadequate. It had been based on photographic review rather than physical inspection, and Warren had not flagged this limitation in the document itself. The report also contained a section that Logan read twice. It described a pattern, not specific to the KA sovereign, but documented across multiple internal communications spanning 14 months, of timeline pressure overriding safety review processes within Kensington Aviation's management structure. The three employees who had submitted additional statements after the preliminary finding had provided documentation of 4 separate incidents in which maintenance or engineering concerns had been deprioritized in the interest of project schedules. 4 incidents. This was not about one aircraft. It was about how a company ran. The report recommended suspension of Kensington Aviation's type certificate pending a comprehensive safety management system audit. It recommended mandatory retraining for engineering and maintenance management. It recommended a formal review of decision-making authority in safety matters to ensure that maintenance specialist certification authority was structurally protected from operational timeline pressure. Logan closed the laptop and sat for a moment. Outside, Sophie's chalk solar system held on, Jupiter with its excessive moons and Pluto with Sophie's handwritten protest label. Should be a planet. This is unfair. The maple tree was fully green now, everything that had been yellow-green and tentative in April having committed to summer without Logan particularly noticing it happen. He thought about the $599 comment, about the room laughing, about standing at the edge of that crowd with his clipboard, the cold coffee, the calculation he'd done in that moment about what he had and what it meant. He thought about a plane at altitude, starboard aileron under stress, the thing that might happen and the thing that wouldn't happen now because somebody had noticed and somebody had written it down and then somebody had refused to let it go. He didn't feel triumphant. That wasn't the right word for it. He felt something closer to relief, maybe. The particular relief of a weight you've been carrying so long you stop noticing it, and then it's gone, and you become aware of its absence all at once. His phone buzzed. Patricia. Report is out. You've seen it? Logan. Yes. Patricia. You okay? He looked at the chalk solar system. He thought about Sophie walking in the door this afternoon and asking him what happened and what he was going to say. Logan. Yeah, I'm okay. He picked up his coffee and went to stand at the back door, looking out at the yard. Somewhere in the facility on Hangar Road, the KA Sovereign sat in FAA custody with its gleaming fuselage and its grounded engines and its unresolved starboard aileron assembly. Somewhere, Amelia Kensington was reading the same 47 pages he'd just finished. He wondered how that felt. He wondered it without malice, just the ordinary human curiosity about what it was like to be inside a different experience. She'd built something, and it had broken in public, and the breaking was partly her fault and partly the fault of the thing she'd built, and those two facts were probably not easy to separate when it was your name on the building. He didn't know what came next, for her, for the company, for the industry, for him. He knew what came in 2.5 hours, which was Sophie coming through the front door and dropping her backpack in the hallway with the particular impact of a second grader who has been carrying it all day, and then asking what was for dinner and telling him 17 things that happened at school, approximately 12 of which would be about space. He knew that. He held on to it. The rest could be figured out when it arrived. Sophie had taped a piece of paper to the refrigerator that morning before school. Logan noticed it when he went to get milk for his coffee. A drawing in colored pencil, slightly lopsided the way second-grade drawings tended to be, of what appeared to be a man in coveralls standing next to a large airplane. The man had brown hair that stuck up in the back, which was accurate, and an enormous smile, which was somewhat aspirational. Underneath it, in Sophie's careful block letters, "My dad fixes planes right." Not a question, a statement of fact. The period at the end was emphatic. Logan stood in front of the refrigerator for a longer moment than strictly necessary, holding the milk carton, looking at it. He took a photo of it with his phone before he did anything else. That was a Tuesday. 3 days after the full FAA report had been released, the world, or at least the specific corner of it that cared about aviation industry accountability, was still processing the 47 pages. Logan was processing them too, in the way that he processed most things, quietly, incrementally, while doing other tasks. He'd read the report twice more since Thursday, not looking for new information, but because reading something carefully was how he made it real to himself, how he moved it from the page into whatever part of him stored things that mattered. The coverage had shifted in tone since the full report. In the first days after the unveiling, the stories had been built around the drama of the moment, the $599 comment, the viral clip, the grounded jet. Now the coverage was more structural, more interested in the systemic failure narrative that the report's 14-month pattern section had opened up. Editorial boards at 2 aviation industry publications had run pieces about safety culture in private aviation. A senator on the Transportation Committee had requested a briefing from the FAA. The story had moved from spectacle to something more like consequence, which was slower and less satisfying to read about, but was, Logan recognized, the part that actually mattered. He had not spoken publicly. Patricia continued to field media inquiries, and the answer to all of them remained the same. Mr. Carter has no comment at this time, and his cooperation with the FAA investigation has been complete. He had not done interviews. He had not posted on social media. He did not have a large social media presence to begin with. He had an account on one platform that he used occasionally to look at aviation content and had never thought of as a broadcasting channel. He kept it that way. But the silence was getting harder to maintain in a specific way that had nothing to do with media and everything to do with the facility on Hangar Road, where the investigation had created an environment that was becoming increasingly difficult to navigate without some kind of clarity about what happened next. The type certificate suspension meant that Kensington Aviation's operational schedule was frozen. No new flight certifications, no aircraft leaving the facility for customer delivery. The practical effect of this was that a significant portion of the work that the maintenance team did on a daily basis was on hold, and the atmosphere that had been tense and watchful in the weeks following the unveiling had shifted into something heavier. The particular weight of a workforce that didn't know if their jobs would exist in 6 months. Logan felt it every day he walked in. People were scared. Not dramatically, not in the ways that made scenes, just the quiet, persistent fear of people who had mortgages and car payments and kids and had done the math on how long they could manage without a paycheck, and the answer was not as long as they'd like. Frank DeLuca, who had been passive-aggressively hostile in the weeks before, had gone quiet. Not friendly, just absent. His hostility had run out of energy, which Logan understood. Sustained hostility required a certainty about who to direct it at, and the situation had become too complicated for that. Ricky Soto found Logan at the workbench on a Wednesday morning and asked, with the direct uncertainty of someone who couldn't pretend not to be worried, "What happens to us? If the audit goes bad? If they can't get the certificate back?" Logan looked at him. He didn't have a reassuring answer, and he wasn't going to manufacture one. "I don't know," he said. Ricky absorbed this. "But you think, you wouldn't have done what you did if you thought it was going to sink everyone, right?" "I did what I did because a plane wasn't safe to fly," Logan said. "The rest of it, the investigation, the report, what happens to the company, that's a consequence of decisions that were already made before I walked into that hangar. I didn't create the defect. I didn't decide to ignore the reports. I just didn't look the other way." Ricky was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I know that." He paused. I'm not blaming you. I just needed to say it out loud, I think." "That's fair," Logan said. They went back to work. There was something clarifying about work, Logan had always found, the way it demanded present-tense attention. A torque spec was a torque spec. A fastener point was a fastener point. The world outside the work could be uncertain and tangled and loud, but the work itself was concrete. It either was or it wasn't. That was, he suspected, a large part of why he'd stayed in maintenance for 11 years, when he probably could have moved into management twice over. The other part was that he was very good at it, and being very good at something was not a small thing, no matter what a $599 joke from a stage might imply. The audit team arrived on the Monday of the following week. 5 people from the FAA's Safety Management System Assessment Division, led by a regional director named Hartwell, who had the particular efficiency of someone who did this regularly and had learned to separate the organizational from the personal without losing sight of why the personal mattered. They set up in the main conference room on the second floor, the one with the glass wall overlooking the tarmac, and began working through the company's safety management documentation, reporting structures, and decision-making protocols. Logan was interviewed twice during the audit, once by Hartwell directly, for about an hour, walking through the same ground he'd covered with the investigation team, but with a different emphasis. Less about the specific defect, more about the processes that had surrounded his reports, how he submitted them, who received them, what the expected response protocol was versus what had actually happened, what he understood to be the chain of authority for safety decisions, and whether that chain had functioned as designed. He answered everything directly and completely. At no point during either interview did he editorialize beyond what was factually supported. He made observations that were supported by documentation. He drew conclusions that were supported by evidence. He did not say this company has a broken culture, even though he believed it, because that was characterization, and characterization was not what he'd been asked for, and also because it was more complicated than that. Cultures weren't broken the way parts were broken. They frayed and calcified and bent in shapes that nobody chose deliberately. Fixing them wasn't about identifying a single defect. It was about understanding the whole system. He said something close to that in his second interview, in response to a question from one of Hartwell's colleagues about whether he believed the KA Sovereign situation was an isolated failure. "No," Logan said. "I think it was the place where the failure became visible. That's different from isolated." The colleague wrote something down. "The visibility came from the event," Logan continued. "If the unveiling had been a private certification test rather than a public launch with cameras, this would have been resolved quietly, one way or another. The fact that it happened publicly is what drove the speed and scale of the response. He paused. "That's not necessarily the right trigger. A safety failure doesn't need an audience to be a safety failure." Hartwell, who had been listening from across the table, looked up from his notes. "What would be the right trigger, in your view?" Logan thought about it. "A system where the reports get a physical inspection response within 2 weeks, where a certification refusal by a senior specialist carries authority that can't be administratively overridden without a documented counter-inspection." He paused. "Where the technician who files the report doesn't have to choose between their job security and their professional judgment." Hartwell nodded slowly. "That's a structural recommendation." "Yes," Logan said. "You've thought about this." "I've had 6 weeks to think about it, and 11 years of context." Hartwell looked at him for a moment with an expression that was hard to read but wasn't dismissive. "We'll note that in our observations," he said. Logan drove home from that second interview on a Thursday afternoon with his windows down again. He did that now when he needed to think. The combination of movement and air did something to his brain that the stationary alternative didn't. He drove through the residential neighborhoods between the airport and his house, the ones with big trees and kids' bikes and driveways and sprinklers running on lawns in the late afternoon sun, and he thought about what came next. He didn't have a clear answer. That was honest. He didn't know what the audit would conclude, though he had opinions. He didn't know what happened to his position, whether Kensington Aviation would survive the audit in a form that still had jobs in it, whether his employment would become untenable in the ways Patricia had warned about, whether the thing he'd spent 11 years building in terms of expertise and reputation would find a place to land when the dust settled, or whether it would need to find a new place entirely. He thought about the structural recommendation he'd made in Hartwell's conference room. He hadn't planned to say it. It had come out the way things come out when you've been thinking about something long enough that it becomes automatic. When the answer to what would be the right trigger is already fully formed because you've been assembling it in the background for weeks. He thought about what it would mean to do that kind of work. Not maintaining aircraft. Redesigning the environment in which aircraft were maintained. The authority structures. The reporting protocols. The culture of a facility, which was built in daily decisions made by people at every level of the organization and not by any single policy document. It was a different kind of work. He wasn't sure he was equipped for it. He also wasn't sure anyone was fully equipped for it, and that maybe the equipping happened through the doing. Sophie was in the driveway when he pulled up, kneeling on the concrete with a piece of chalk, adding something to the edge of the solar system diagram that had migrated from the patio. She looked up when he got out of the truck. "I'm giving Neptune a name," she told him, with the tone of someone announcing a minor administrative decision. "The planet, not the moon. I know the planet doesn't have a name, but I think it should." "What name?" he asked, crouching down beside her. She held up the chalk to show him what she'd written. Maya. Logan went very still. Sophie was watching him with the careful attention she deployed when she wasn't sure how something was going to land. "Is that okay?" she asked. He looked at the name written in Sophie's careful block letters on the concrete, surrounded by blue chalk representing space and the wobbly circle of Neptune's orbit. "Yeah," he said. His voice came out a little rough and he cleared his throat. "That's more than okay, Bug." Sophie nodded, satisfied, and went back to filling in the color. Logan sat on the concrete beside her for a while, watching her work, not saying much. The afternoon went copper and then pink around them. A plane crossed the sky. He was still sitting there mentally when Amelia Kensington came to his door. It was a Saturday morning, 17 days after the audit team had arrived and 11 days after they'd finished their work and left. The audit report was not yet public. The FAA was still in the formal review period. But enough had been communicated to the company's board that the internal situation at Kensington Aviation was moving, slowly, through whatever territory came after public collapse and regulatory intervention. Logan was in the kitchen when the doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone. Sophie was at a birthday party. He'd dropped her at the Delgados with 3 other second graders at 9, all of them wearing the same expression of barely contained chaos the children wear when presented with cake and a bouncy castle. The house was quiet in the particular way it only got when Sophie wasn't in it, the quiet that Logan used for paperwork and thinking and sometimes just sitting in. He opened the door. Amelia Kensington was standing on his front porch, not in the slate gray blazer this time. A plain dark jacket, jeans, no visible PR handler, no car with a driver that he could see. Just her, standing on his porch on a Saturday morning, and the expression on her face was not the one she'd worn in the hangar. That one had been controlled and polished and performing competence for an audience. This one was, he searched for the right word and came up with unmediated. Whatever was on her face was what was actually there, unprocessed. She looked like she hadn't been sleeping well. He recognized the signs. He'd had his own version of it. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Ms. Kensington." He didn't open the door wider, but he didn't close it either. He waited. She held his gaze. That was the first thing he noticed. She didn't look away, didn't manage her eye contact the way people sometimes did when they were about to say something rehearsed. She just looked at him directly, which cost her something. He could see that. "I'd like to talk to you, if you're willing." He considered this for a moment. He thought about calling Patricia, and then he thought about the fact that this was his home and his door, and the decision was his to make. "All right," he said. "Come in." He led her to the kitchen, the only room in the house that felt neutral enough for a conversation he couldn't predict. The living room had Maya's photograph on the shelf and Sophie's book stacked on the coffee table and too much of him in it. The kitchen was functional, honest. He offered her coffee and she said yes, and he made it because it gave him something to do with his hands while he figured out what this was. She sat at the kitchen table. She didn't take her jacket off. She held her hands together in front of her on the table, not the interlaced, performing calm gesture he'd seen in the hangar, but loose, both hands just resting there. He put the coffee in front of her and sat across from her with his own. She looked at the solar system worksheet still on the table from the night before. Sophie had been revising Neptune's orbit with a protractor, and then she looked at him. "You have a daughter," she said. "Sophie, 7. She nodded. She looked at the worksheet for another second, then back up. "I watched the footage from the hangar," she said, "the footage of what I said from the stage. I've watched it more times than I should probably admit." She stopped. "The expression on your face, you didn't react. You just stood there." "I had other things to think about," Logan said. I know that now." She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. I want to tell you something, and I need you to know that I'm not here because my lawyers told me to come. My lawyers would actually prefer I wasn't here. I'm here because I needed to say this in person, and not through a statement or a representative or any other way that lets me manage the distance between what I did and what I need to say about it. Logan didn't say anything. He waited. Amelia looked at her coffee, then back at him. What I said from that stage was wrong, not legally wrong, though I understand there are implications in that direction. Wrong as in, what I did to you as a person was wrong. I took something you'd been doing carefully and honestly for 6 weeks, and I turned it into a punchline in front of a room full of people because it was convenient for me to do that, because it made the story of the morning work the way I needed it to work. She paused. I knew about your reports before I got on that stage. I'd been briefed, and I got up there anyway, and I made that joke. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the neighbor's lawnmower started up, ran for 30 seconds, stopped. You knew, Logan said. He said it simply, without heat, just checking the factual record. I knew there had been maintenance concerns flagged. I was told they'd been reviewed and cleared, but I also... She stopped. She pushed her coffee mug slightly to one side, a small gesture of discomfort. I also didn't ask the right questions. I asked if it was handled, and I accepted the answer, and I didn't ask how. Because I didn't want to slow down. Because that launch was 3 years of work. 3 years of decisions and funding rounds and personnel and engineering and relationships, and I had built so much of it on the idea that this moment was coming, that it would go the way I'd planned it, that it would be the thing that made all the rest of it make sense. Logan looked at her. The launch mattered more than the reports. Yes, she said it plainly, without the softening that might have made it easier to hear. That's what my decisions amounted to, even if that wasn't what I told myself at the time. He thought about what it cost her to say that, here, at his kitchen table, without a lawyer present. He thought about 30 years old and 3 years of work and a room full of investors, and the particular terror of a plan not going the way you'd designed it. He didn't excuse any of it, but he let himself understand it. I don't know what you want from me, he said honestly. She looked at him. I don't want you to absolve me. I'm not here for that. She paused. I came because I needed you to know that I understand what I did, not just what I did to the launch, not just what it cost the company. What I did to you, specifically. The $599 comment, standing on that stage, and she pressed her lips together. You're a person. You had been trying to protect people for 6 weeks, and I used you as a prop for a joke. Logan was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands on the table, the knuckles, the calluses, the permanent gray of grease he'd stopped trying to fully remove years ago. Okay, he said. She looked at him. Okay? I mean, I hear you. He paused. I'm not going to tell you it didn't happen. It happened. It landed the way it was designed to land. The room laughed. He looked up at her. And then I walked to the nose of your aircraft, and I held up the certification documentation, and the room stopped laughing. Something crossed her face. Not quite a wince, but close. The apology matters, he said. I'm not dismissing it, but the thing that actually mattered was the record, the timestamps, the reports, the refusal. Those are what protected people, not whatever I felt standing at the edge of that crowd. She was quiet for a long time. The lawnmower next door started again. This time it kept going. I want to rebuild the company, Amelia said. I want to rebuild it correctly. And I'm aware that my saying that sounds like exactly the kind of thing someone says when they need to rehabilitate their public image and are calculating the most effective way to do it. She looked at him directly. I can't make you believe that's not what this is. I can only tell you that I've spent the last 6 weeks looking at 47 pages of federal documentation that describes what my company became, and I don't... She stopped. I don't want that to be what I built. Logan looked at her. He thought about what Hartwell had asked him, what would be the right trigger, and his answer, and the way Hartwell had written something down. The audit report, he said, when it's published. Yes. It's going to recommend structural changes to the safety management system, to the reporting protocols, to the decision-making authority for maintenance concerns. He paused. Those recommendations aren't optional. The type certificate doesn't come back without them. I know. Implementing them on paper is different from implementing them in practice, he said. You can rewrite every policy document in the building and still have a facility where a technician doesn't believe his report is going to matter, because that belief doesn't come from policy. It comes from what actually happens, repeatedly, over time. She was watching him carefully. You're talking about culture. I'm talking about the daily decisions. Who gets listened to? What happens when someone raises a concern that's inconvenient? Whether the person who files the fourth report is still taken seriously or whether they've been marked as a problem. He paused. That's not something the audit fixes. That's something that gets built or rebuilt every single day by the people with the authority to set the tone. People like me, she said. Yes. She looked at the solar system worksheet on the table again. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, I want to offer you a role. Director of Aviation Safety. She said it carefully, clearly, not as a performance. Full authority over the safety management system. Direct reporting to me outside the operations chain. Ability to stop any certification, any delivery, any flight clearance without going through the management structure that buried your reports. She paused. I'm not offering this to fix my PR problem. I'm offering it because I looked at what happened and I understood that the thing the company needs most is someone in that position who has already demonstrated, in the most expensive and public way possible, that they won't let the timeline override the work. Logan looked at her. He sat with it. You could just hire a safety consultant, he said. Someone with credentials and a clean relationship with the company. No history. I could, she said. But you know what my company looks like from the inside of the machinery. You know where the actual decisions get made. And she paused, and he had the impression she was choosing the next thing carefully. The people on that floor trust you, not because of any of this, because of 11 years. That's not something I can hire from outside. He thought about Ricky Soto at the workbench asking what happens to us. He thought about Dale Pruitt's daughter studying aerospace engineering. He thought about the 4 other incidents in 14 months that the investigation had uncovered, the ones that had never had a Logan Carter in the right position at the right time. He thought about what he'd said to Hartwell, where the technician who files the report doesn't have to choose between their job security and their professional judgment. He could make that real. Not in a policy document, in practice. Daily. He also thought about Sophie, about what it meant to take a job that was bigger and more visible and more embattled than the one he had, about what it meant to walk back into a facility as something other than the technician who'd been told he wasn't worth $599, about whether he was ready for what came with that, the organizational resistance, the people who would resent the authority, the days when the decisions would be genuinely hard and the right answer wouldn't be as clear as a structural defect in a trailing edge assembly. He thought about Maya, who had been a history teacher, and believed in the idea that small decisions made by ordinary people in ordinary moments became the hinge points that everything else swung on. I need to think about it, he said. Amelia nodded. She had the particular composure of someone who had prepared themselves for multiple outcomes and was not going to show which one they'd hoped for. Of course, she said. I also need to talk to Patricia Okafor before I agree to anything. Understood. And if I do this, he paused. The authority has to be real, not nominal. If I stop a certification and someone above me in the operational chain disagrees, the certification stays stopped until there is a documented physical inspection that resolves the disagreement, in writing, with signatures. Yes. And the people who filed statements during the investigation, Ricky Soto, the others, their employment is protected, not just on paper. I need to know they're not being managed out quietly in 6 months. Something in her expression shifted. Not offense. Something more like recognition. I wouldn't do that, she said. I'm not saying you would, Logan said. I'm saying I need it as a condition, because intent and outcome don't always match, and I want the structure to support the intent. She looked at him. All right, she said. Agreed. The lawnmower next door had stopped at some point without him noticing. The kitchen was quiet again. Through the window, the backyard sat in morning sun. the concrete patio, the faded chalk solar system, Maya written in Sophie's careful letters next to Neptune's orbit. Amelia followed his gaze through the window. She looked at the chalk diagram for a moment. Your daughter did that? She's been adding to it for weeks, Logan said. It started as a school project. The planet names... She named Neptune after her mother, Logan said. My wife. She passed 4 years ago. Amelia looked at the diagram for another moment. When she looked back at him, whatever was in her face had shifted again, more unguarded than before, which he hadn't expected. I'm sorry, she said. And it was the kind of sorry that wasn't about the current situation at all. Just one person acknowledging another person's loss, which was its own kind of thing. Thank you, he said. They sat in the kitchen for a few more minutes, not talking much. The particular quiet of two people who have said the important things and are waiting to see where they land. Logan refilled both their coffee mugs because the coffee was still good, and it seemed like the right thing to do. And Amelia accepted it, and neither of them made anything out of that small, ordinary gesture. Before she left, she paused in the front doorway. She had her hands in her jacket pockets now, less formal than the interlaced fingers, more like a person just standing in a doorway. For what it's worth, she said, the $599 thing, I thought about it a lot, what I was actually saying when I said that. What were you saying? Logan asked. She was quiet for a moment. I think I was saying that the people who protect the machine are less important than the machine, she said. And I think I believe that, or I think I'd built a company where I operated as if I believed that, and the difference between those two things wasn't as clear to me as it should have been. Logan looked at her. And now? She held his gaze. Now I'm standing on the porch of the man who proved me wrong, she said. So, he almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. He watched her walk down the porch steps and to the car he now saw parked 2 houses down. Not a driver, just a car, which he noted without commenting on. She got in. She drove away. He stood in his doorway for a minute after she was gone. The street was quiet. Someone's dog barked twice in the middle distance and then stopped. The maple tree in the front yard had gone fully green, the kind of green that only happens in early summer when the leaves are still new enough to be vivid. He closed the door and went back to the kitchen. He sat down at the table where the solar system worksheet was, and where 2 coffee mugs sat, and where Sophie would come home in approximately 2 hours and want to tell him everything about the bouncy castle and also revise her opinion of something about the outer planets. He pulled out his phone and called Patricia. She picked up on the second ring. I'm guessing this isn't about your benefit paperwork, she said. Amelia Kensington was just here, he said. She offered me a position. A silence on Patricia's end that was one of her more loaded silences. Tell me everything, she said. He told her. All of it. The conditions he'd named, her responses, the authority structure he'd described, and she'd agreed to. Patricia listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Patricia, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment longer. The conditions are solid, she said finally. The written authority structure, the protected employment for the employees who testified, those are things I can get put into a formal agreement. Can we trust it? We can put it in a contract, Patricia said, which is a different kind of trust, but it's the kind that has consequences. A pause. The question is whether you want to do this. Logan looked at Sophie's solar system, at Neptune with its chalk-labeled name, at the solar system that had started as a school project and turned into something that had been on his patio for weeks because a 7-year-old had decided it was worth preserving. I think I do, he said. Then we make sure it's structured correctly, Patricia said. Leave the negotiation to me. You show up and you do the work. He thought about Ricky Soto, about Dale's daughter, about the technician somewhere in some facility who was writing a report right now that would either be read or not read, and what determined which one of those things happened. Yeah, he said. That's what I do. The contract took 3 weeks to negotiate. Patricia was thorough in the way that people are thorough when they understand that the gap between what something says and what something does is where most promises go to die. She went through every clause, every definition, every structural detail with the kind of attention that Logan recognized from his own work. The recognition that what you miss in the small print is exactly what comes back to matter later. He sat in on 2 of the negotiation sessions, mostly listening, occasionally clarifying technical language around the safety authority structures when Sandra Marsh's legal drafting used terminology that sounded precise but was actually vague in the specific ways that gave management flexibility to override decisions later. He caught 3 of those. Patricia caught 5 more. By the end of the 3rd week, the contract was 51 pages long and contained language that Logan had spent 2 evenings reading with the focused attention he normally reserved for inspection reports. The authority structure was real. The certification stop authority was unambiguous. If Logan halted a certification, it stayed halted until a documented physical inspection by an independent assessor resolved the underlying concern. The employment protections for Ricky Soto and the 4 other employees who had testified were in writing with specific remediation clauses if they were violated. His reporting line went directly to Amelia, bypassing the operations and engineering management chains entirely. On a Tuesday afternoon in the 2nd week of June, Logan Carter signed it. He signed it at Patricia's office desk with Patricia beside him and a notary present and Sandra Marsh across the table, looking like someone who had argued herself hoarse and arrived at the end of the process with a grudging respect for the outcome, which Logan thought was probably the best available version of Sandra Marsh. He used his own pen, the same kind of heavy ballpoint he always used for documentation. Nothing special about it, just the pen he used. He signed the way he signed everything, clearly, completely, without hesitation. "Congratulations," Patricia said. She said it simply, without ceremony, which was how Patricia did most things. "Thank you," Logan said, "for all of it." She waved her hand in the small gesture she used when she considered acknowledgement unnecessary. "Go do good work," she said. "That's the point." He drove to Pineview Elementary on the way home to pick up Sophie, who came out of the building with her backpack listing to the left, the way it always did when she'd loaded it with library books. She climbed into the truck and announced before she'd finished buckling her seatbelt that her class had started a new unit on ecosystems, and she had opinions about food chains. "Tell me," Logan said. She told him. For 11 minutes, all the way home, she explained the food chain with the particular intensity she brought to subjects that had recently captured her attention. Logan listened and asked questions and thought, in the background of his mind, about what started Monday. He told her that night after dinner, while she was helping him clear the table in the way she helped, enthusiastically but imprecisely, plates stacked at angles that made him quietly nervous. "I'm starting a new job," he said. "Still at the same place, but different work." Sophie set a plate down and looked at him. "What kind of different?" "I'm going to be in charge of making sure the planes are safe. Not just the ones I personally inspect, all of them. I'll be setting up systems so that when any technician finds something wrong, it gets addressed. Every time." Sophie considered this. "Like a referee?" Logan thought about it. "Sort of. More like the person who makes sure the rules exist and actually get followed." "That's different from fixing planes." "It is." She picked up the plate again, more carefully this time. "Do you want to do it?" He looked at her, 7 years old, and she still asked the questions that went directly to the center. "Yeah," he said, "I think so." "Because it needs doing?" "That too," he said, "but also because I think I can." Sophie appeared to weigh this. "Okay," she said in the tone she used when she'd assessed something and found it acceptable. She carried the plate to the counter. "Can you still tell me about planes?" "I'll always tell you about planes." "Good." She climbed onto the kitchen stool. "Because Marcus says his uncle works in aviation, and that guy doesn't know anything about how planes actually work. He just does the business part." "There's room for both," Logan said. "I know, but one of them is more important." He didn't argue with her. He wasn't sure she was wrong. His first day as director of aviation safety at Kensington Aviation fell on a Monday, mid-June, warm and clear, the kind of morning that felt like an argument for the world being basically manageable. He arrived at the same time he always had, early, before the bulk of the crew, when the facility was in the quiet transition between night shift and day. He wore the same kind of clothes he always wore, dark pants, a collared shirt, no tie, because a tie in a maintenance facility was a statement about priorities that he didn't want to make. He had a new badge, new office, one of the second-floor rooms with a window, which he'd accepted because Patricia told him that the physical location of his office communicated something about his authority, and she was right about that. He stood in the new office for about 30 seconds and then went downstairs to the floor. He wanted to be seen down there. Not announced, not introduced with fanfare, just present. He wanted the people who worked those bays to know that the person in the safety role was the same person who'd been at the workbench beside them, who knew what a torque spec felt like in his hands, who understood the difference between a maintenance report that documented a real concern and one that was generated to satisfy a compliance checkbox. Ricky Soto found him near Bay 3. "First day," Ricky said, with the specific grin of someone who is happy about something but doesn't want to oversell it. "First day," Logan agreed. "Weird seeing you without the coveralls." "I'll probably still wear them sometimes." Logan looked at the bay, at the aircraft in it, a mid-range charter jet, routine maintenance cycle. "How's the team doing?" Ricky's grin settled into something more honest. "Cautious," he said. "People don't know what this looks like yet. The new setup. They've been told things before and then it turned out to be the same thing in different packaging." "That's fair," Logan said. "What do you need from us?" "Same thing I've always needed," Logan said. "Write it down, accurately, every time. If something's wrong, say so. Don't assume it won't matter because of who's listening." He paused. "I'm listening. That's what I'm here for." Ricky nodded. He seemed to want to say something else, and Logan waited. "There are people who are glad you're here," Ricky said. "And there are people who... There's some resentment. People who feel like what happened put the company at risk, and jobs at risk, and you were the..." He stopped. "I'm just telling you so you're not caught off guard." "I know," Logan said. "I expected it." "Frank DeLuca was in the break room this morning saying some things." "Frank DeLuca is going to say things," Logan said evenly. "That's okay. I'm not here to make everyone comfortable. I'm here to make the work right." Ricky nodded once, solidly, like something had been confirmed. He went back to his bay. Logan stood on the floor for another few minutes, just being present, and then went upstairs to start the actual work. The actual work was, in many ways, harder than any inspection he'd ever done. Not technically. The technical part was where he was most comfortable, and the technical gaps in Kensington Aviation's safety management system were real and identifiable and addressable in the concrete way that structural defects were addressable. He spent the first 2 weeks mapping them, the places where reporting protocols had ambiguous language that allowed management discretion to filter concerns before they became documented records. The inspection intervals that had been quietly extended past manufacturer recommendations. The counter-assessment process that had allowed Phil Warren to review photographs from a desk and file a formal clearance without setting foot near the aircraft. He wrote a 40-page internal assessment. He did not soften it. He documented every gap clearly, referenced the specific incidents from the FAA investigation report where those gaps had produced real consequences, and attached proposed protocol revisions for each one. He sent it to Amelia with a cover note that said, "This is what I found. These are the changes I recommend. Let me know if you want to discuss any of it." She called him the same afternoon. "Some of this is going to be expensive," she said. "Yes," he said. The extended inspection intervals, those were approved by the operations team because the manufacturer's standards were creating scheduling conflicts. "I know why they happened," Logan said. "That doesn't change what they are." A pause. "No," she said. "You're right. It doesn't." He could hear her thinking on the other end. The counter-assessment process, the changes you're proposing, require a physical inspection by a different specialist than the one who filed the original report. That's going to add time to our certification cycles. "Yes." "How much time?" "Depends on the backlog. 3 to 7 days on average, based on current staffing. If we add 2 more specialists to the rotation, probably down to 2 to 4. So we add the specialists." "That's my recommendation." Another pause. Longer. Logan waited. He'd learned in his first 2 weeks that Amelia processed decisions in a specific way. She needed to see the full shape of the cost before she could commit to accepting it. Not because she was looking for a way around it, but because she'd spent years operating in environments where every dollar was a decision and she was still recalibrating toward a frame where some costs weren't optional. Okay, she said, all of it. I want the revised protocols on the operations team's desk by end of next week. They won't all be happy about it. I know. A beat. That's why you have direct authority, so their happiness isn't the determining factor. He appreciated that she said it plainly. He knew she meant it. He also knew that the gap between meaning something and living it out when a deadline was pressing and a client was calling and the operations team was pushing back would be its own test, and that test hadn't come yet. It came in the third week of August. A delivery deadline for a completed charter aircraft. A client who had been waiting for the jet since the type certificate suspension had complicated the company's schedule. The jet had been through its full maintenance cycle and was technically ready for certification. Operations had it flagged as priority, the client had already rescheduled once, and the pressure to get the aircraft off the ground was real and specific and communicated in the particular way that deadline pressure always communicated. Through the tone of emails, through the pace of conversations in corridors, through the background hum of everyone in the chain of authority being aware that this moment mattered. Logan reviewed the certification package the morning it came to his desk. Everything was in order. Mostly. On page 14 of the maintenance log, a notation from the previous week's inspection referenced an anomaly in the hydraulic pressure readings on the nose gear system. Flagged, noted, and then cleared in a follow-up line that said, "Within acceptable parameters. No further action required." He pulled the follow-up documentation. The clearance had been written by a junior technician named Vasquez 2 years in, who had run a secondary pressure test and gotten a reading that was technically inside the acceptable range but on the low end of it. Logan called Vasquez up to his office. Vasquez was 26, nervous in the way people were nervous when they'd been called to a new director's office during a high-pressure week. He sat across from Logan with the careful posture of someone who wasn't sure if they'd done something wrong. "Walk me through the nose gear hydraulic check," Logan said. Vasquez walked him through it. His reading had been 2,847 pounds per square inch. The acceptable floor was 2,800 pounds per square inch. He'd run the test twice to confirm. Both readings were in the same range. He'd documented both. He'd cleared it. "Did anything about that reading concern you?" Logan asked. Vasquez was quiet for a moment. "I mean, it was in range." "That's not what I asked." Another moment. Vasquez's hands, resting on his knees, shifted slightly. "It was at the low end," he said, "and the aircraft had been sitting during the suspension period. I know pressure can drop over extended inactivity, so I told myself that was probably it." "Did you document that reasoning?" "No." "Why not?" Vasquez looked at him. "Because it was in range. I didn't think—" "The reasoning matters," Logan said. He kept his voice even. He wasn't trying to frighten the kid. "Not just the number. The number tells me what you measured. The reasoning tells me what you were thinking when you measured it. If 6 months from now someone looks at this record, they need to understand the full picture. And if the pressure reading is at the low end again on a future check, I need to know whether there's a trend. And I can't know that if the only documentation is a clearance without context." Vasquez nodded slowly. "So I want a supplemental notation added to the maintenance log. Your reasoning, the inactive storage factor, and a recommendation for a recheck at the 30-day mark post-delivery." Logan paused. "And the certification goes on hold until that notation is in the record." Vasquez stared at him. "The client is— I know what the client situation is," Logan said. "The notation will take you 45 minutes. The certification hold will be cleared today." He looked at Vasquez steadily. "I'm not punishing you. You ran 2 tests, you documented both. You didn't fake the clearance. That's all correct? I'm asking for the full picture. That's always the requirement." Vasquez nodded. He was quiet for a moment, and then something in his expression shifted. Not relief exactly, but something in the direction of it, like a knot that had been held tight loosening by 1 degree. "Okay," he said. "I can do that." "I know you can," Logan said. "Go do it." Vasquez left. Logan pulled up his email and sent a note to the operations coordinator and to Amelia. "Certification. Hold on the charter aircraft pending supplemental documentation. Estimated clearance, end of day. Will confirm. The operations coordinator responded in 4 minutes. We have a client on the phone about delivery timeline. Logan responded, clearance by end of day. That's the timeline. Amelia's response came 11 minutes later after he imagined she'd talked to the operations coordinator and understood the full picture. Understood. Keep me posted. Not, can we speed this up? Not, is this strictly necessary? Just, understood. He sat with that for a moment. It was a small thing, an email response. But the gap between what it said and what it could have said was where the actual culture lived. And this was evidence of the culture that was being built, one interaction at a time, one decision at a time. Vasquez's notation was in the system by 3 in the afternoon. Logan reviewed it, confirmed it was complete and accurate, and cleared the certification. The aircraft was delivered the following morning, 1 day later than planned. The client was annoyed. The client got over it. No hydraulic system failed at altitude. Nothing dramatic happened. That was exactly the point. The whole point was for nothing dramatic to happen, for the work to be done right, so that the only things that occurred were the ordinary, unspectacular outcomes of aircraft functioning the way they were supposed to. The drama was what you were trying to prevent. The success looked like nothing, which was the hardest thing to explain to people who measured success by things they could see and point at. Logan was explaining this, approximately, to Amelia over coffee in her office one afternoon in September. She had started a practice of meeting with him every 2 weeks, not formally, not with agendas and minutes, just to talk through what was happening in the facility and what he was seeing and what she needed to understand. He'd been skeptical of these meetings at first, wondering whether they were genuine or performative, but they had turned out to be genuine in the specific way that genuine things were. Inconsistent and occasionally frustrating and not always comfortable, because Amelia was still who she was, still operating with the particular intensity of someone for whom stopping felt dangerous, and that sometimes created friction with what Logan needed her to hear. The Vasquez situation, she said. I got pushback from the operations team about the hold. They feel like the new protocols are creating delays that... The delays are the protocols working, Logan said. I know that. I told them that. She turned her coffee mug in her hands. But I need you to understand that every time there's a hold, even a 4-hour hold, there's a cost conversation happening somewhere in the building. I'm not telling you to change the decision. I'm telling you what the environment is. What do you want me to do with that information? She looked at him. I want you to help me make the case internally. The protocols need advocates beyond just you and me. The operations team isn't going to stop pushing back because I say so. They need to understand why the delays are worth the cost in a way that isn't just because Logan said so. He thought about that. She wasn't wrong. He'd been doing the work of implementing the protocols, but he hadn't been doing the work of building understanding around them. The kind of understanding that allowed a system to hold itself up when the person who built it wasn't in the room. All right, he said, I'll put together a session for the operations leads and the engineering team together. Walk them through the case in terms they respond to. What terms are those? Liability, schedule predictability, client retention. He paused. The cost of one serious incident versus the cumulative cost of 4-hour holds over a year. Those are terms they'll respond to. Amelia nodded. Can you have it by end of month? Yes. She looked at him. You know you could have just done the technical work and not gotten involved in the organizational side of this. That wasn't the deal, Logan said. I know, but a lot of people in your position would have drawn that line. He thought about what it would mean to draw that line, to implement the protocols and leave the culture to sort itself out, to do the parts he was comfortable with and leave the uncomfortable parts to someone else. He thought about all the people who had done that at Kensington Aviation before him, who had known things and said nothing, or said something and not pushed, or pushed once and accepted the resistance as definitive. The protocols are only as good as the environment around them, he said. I've seen what happens when you fix the paper and leave the air. She was quiet for a moment. So have I, she said. Not defensively, just honestly. The case for the operations and engineering leads happened on a Thursday in late September. Logan had prepared it carefully, not as a lecture, not as a post-incident debrief, but as a conversation about what the data actually showed when you looked at the cost of safety delays versus the cost of safety failures over a 5-year horizon. He used industry data from publicly available FAA records and NTSB incident reports. He built a model of Kensington Aviation's own schedule over the past 14 months, including the delays caused by the KA sovereign situation, and compared it to the projected delay impact of the new protocol schedule. The new delays were smaller, significantly smaller, and they were bounded and predictable, which meant clients could be managed around them, whereas the unbounded delay of a federal investigation and type certificate suspension could not be managed around at all. He said all of this plainly, without drama, in a conference room with 12 people who had varying degrees of enthusiasm for being there. The operations coordinator, a man named Beaumont, who had been with the company 8 years and had a deeply ingrained habit of thinking about problems in terms of that week's schedule rather than next year's risk, sat in the back row with his arms crossed for the first 15 minutes. By minute 25, Beaumont's arms were on the table. He was looking at the 5-year cost model. "This assumes 0 incidents in the baseline," Beaumont said, "but we haven't had an incident in 5 years of operation." "You haven't had a reported incident," Logan said. "The FAA investigation documented 4 safety concerns that were managed internally without formal incident reporting over the past 14 months. Beaumont was quiet. "I'm not saying those would have become incidents," Logan said. "I'm saying we don't know, because the protocol for resolving them was to handle them quietly, which means we have no data on the outcome." He paused. "The new protocols generate data. They tell us what we caught, how we caught it, what happened when we addressed it. That data is what we use to improve. Without it, we're managing by instinct and hoping the instinct is right." A woman named Torres, unrelated to the FAA investigator, this Torres headed up engineering scheduling, said from the left side of the table, "What's the actual impact on our Q4 delivery cycle?" 11 days of aggregate additional time across the scheduled Q4 deliveries based on current staffing, Logan said. "That drops to 7 if we add the 2 specialists I've already recommended." "You want us to hire 2 people to save 4 days on Q4. I want you to hire 2 people to build a safety operation that functions correctly under load, and the side effect of that is 4 days on Q4. He looked around the table. "We can keep doing it the lean way. We've seen what the lean way costs when something goes wrong." He didn't belabor it. He just let it sit there. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Beaumont said slowly, "If we hire the specialists, can you guarantee the 7-day number?" "I can commit to it as a target. I can't guarantee it because variables exist, but I can tell you that the 7-day estimate is based on conservative assumptions." Beaumont looked at Torres. Torres looked at her notes. Around the table, something shifted. Not a transformation, not a revelation, just the slow renegotiation of a room full of practical people who had been given information they couldn't reasonably dismiss. The 2 specialists were approved 3 weeks later. By November, the new protocols had been in operation long enough to generate real data, and the data was becoming the most effective argument Logan had. 12 concerns flagged in the reporting system. 12 secondary reviews conducted, 11 cleared within the standard window. 1. A fuel system irregularity on a light business jet had required a full repair cycle that delayed the aircraft's delivery by 9 days and cost the company approximately $40,000 in labor and parts. That aircraft's client was frustrated. The client's legal team sent a letter. Sandra Marsh drafted a response. The aircraft went through the repair cycle, was re-inspected, was certified, flew its delivery flight without incident, and the client's next booking was processed 2 months later. Logan documented the full case internally. Irregularity found. Work order generated. Repair completed. Recertification passed. Outcome: aircraft operating normally. He attached it to his monthly safety report with the note, "This is what the protocol is for." The cost was real. So was the alternative. Amelia included a version of that note in the company's quarterly communication to the board. The board, who had spent the first half of the year managing the fallout of the KA sovereign investigation, received it differently than they might have received it 6 months earlier. The type certificate was fully reinstated in December, following the completion of the safety management system audit, and Kensington Aviation's documented implementation of the recommended changes. The reinstatement came with conditions: 6-month follow-up review, mandatory reporting to the FAA on any certification holds above 48 hours, that Logan had expected and built into his protocols in advance. He was at his desk when the formal notification arrived. He read it, made a note in the internal record, and sent Amelia a one-line email. Type certificate reinstated. Formal notification attached. Her response came back in 3 minutes. Come to my office when you have a minute. He went up. She was standing at the window when he arrived, looking out at the tarmac below. The service bays, the aircraft moving in and out. The ordinary functioning of a facility that was now functioning correctly. She turned when he came in. December, she said. 8 months. 8 months, he agreed. She looked at him with the expression he'd come to recognize, the one she wore when she was being direct about something that didn't have a managed version. I want to tell you something, she said. And I want to tell it to you before the board communications and the press release and all the machinery that comes with good news. He waited. When I started this company, she said, I had a version of it in my head that was about the aircraft, the technology, the design, the capability, the things I could build. She paused. I didn't think very hard about the people who made the building possible. I thought I did. I had the vocabulary. Employees are our greatest asset, team-first culture, all of it. But I hadn't ever been in a situation where I had to choose between the people and the thing they were building. And when I chose the thing. She met his eyes. You already know that. I'm not telling you something new. Then why are you telling me? Because I want you to know that I see it now in a way I didn't before. Not because of the investigation, not because of the reputational cost, because... She stopped. She looked out the window again, at the tarmac. There's a technician on the floor right now named Vasquez. I talked to him last week. Not about anything in particular, just one of those hallway conversations. He told me he filed a notation last month on a pressure anomaly that was technically in range, but felt low to him. He said he almost didn't document the reasoning. Then he remembered what you told him, so he wrote it down. Logan was quiet. He said it like it was small, Amelia said. Like it was just a thing that happened. But I kept thinking about it after. She turned back to him. That's the thing, isn't it? It's not the 47-page report. It's Vasquez writing down the reasoning, and the next person doing the same thing, and the one after that. Yes, Logan said. That's the thing. She nodded. She seemed to be working through something. I spent my 30s, or the beginning of them, building something. I thought I understood what I was building. I didn't, quite. I understood the architecture, but not the foundation. She paused. You understand the foundation. He thought about that. He thought about what it meant to work with your hands, to develop the specific intelligence that came from repeated physical contact with the thing itself, the machine, the material, the problem. To know a fastener point not as a coordinate on a schematic, but as a specific location you'd touched with your own hands, that had felt a specific way, that had told you something the schematic couldn't. I know what I know, he said. It took 11 years to know it. I'm aware that I'm asking you to rebuild something I broke, she said. I want you to know I'm aware of that. You're not asking me to rebuild it, he said. You're asking me to build what it should have been. That's different. He paused. The thing that was here before, the culture, the tolerance for managed risk, that wasn't something you built deliberately. It was something that grew in the space where accountability wasn't. Rebuilding it right means filling that space with something deliberate. He looked at her. That's what we're doing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said quietly, thank you for staying. He thought about the contract, the 51 pages. The conditions he'd named and Patricia had sharpened and Sandra Marsh had argued over and Amelia had ultimately signed. He thought about the Saturday morning on his front porch, her hands in her jacket pockets, the particular cost of what she'd come to say. He thought about Sophie's drawing on the refrigerator. My dad fixes planes right. I'm not finished yet, he said. She almost smiled. He'd learned that about her. The almost smile, the way she held the full version of it slightly back, like something she wasn't quite sure she'd earned. This time, it was closer than usual. "No," she said, "neither am I." The holidays came and went in the way they always did. Too fast, too full of the particular mixture of warmth and exhaustion, and the feeling that you hadn't quite been present for the parts you'd wanted to be present for. Sophie had a winter concert where she played a recorder with the specific commitment of a second grader who had been practicing for 6 weeks and was going to give this everything she had, regardless of whether everything she had was technically in tune. Logan sat in the third row and filmed it on his phone and sent the video to Claire and their aunt in Philadelphia, who sent back a string of emojis that expressed enthusiasm, if not detailed musical criticism. He took 10 days off over the break. Real off, Patricia had insisted. And Patricia had the authority of someone who had watched enough people in high-stakes roles run themselves into the ground to understand when rest was not optional. He fixed the loose board on the back porch that had been loose since September. He took Sophie to the Science Museum, where she spent 45 minutes in the space exhibit, telling him things he already knew about Jupiter while he listened as though hearing them for the first time, because the point was not the information. He cooked dinner most nights, which was meditative in the way that physical work with a clear outcome always was. On the last night of the break, after Sophie was in bed, he sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the quiet house around him. The chalk solar system on the back patio had finally faded into near invisibility over the fall. Rain and foot traffic and time had done what Sophie's protests could not delay forever. Just the ghost of it remained, the suggestion of orbits and labels. He thought about the year, about where January had been, standing in a parking lot after the unveiling, sitting in his truck, Sophie's cereal bowl, and her 7-year-old certainty that he'd done the right thing. The cold coffee, the clipboard, the words still there written in the margin. He thought about fastener point 11, about how a thing that small, in a surface so large, in a machine so complex, had set in motion everything that followed. He didn't believe in neat narratives where single causes produce single effects and the universe arranged things with moral intention. He'd spent too long looking at failure analysis reports for that. Things failed for reasons that were almost always multiple and overlapping and not quite anybody's fault, and almost everybody's fault simultaneously. But he did believe this. The act of looking carefully at a thing and writing down what you saw and refusing to let the writing be erased, that was not a small act. It had never been small. It was how the record got built. The whole record, of everything, of what happened and who noticed and what they did about it. Maya had taught history. She had spent years teaching teenagers to read primary sources, the letters and the diaries and the official documents and the ones that weren't official at all, the ones written on the back of receipts or in the margins of other things. She'd believed that the people who made history weren't the people in the portraits. They were the ones who wrote things down when the thing was happening, who created the record that allowed everything else to be understood later. He hadn't thought about that connection until now, sitting in the quiet kitchen. He thought about it. He thought she would have found it funny. Or maybe not funny exactly, but satisfying in the particular way of things that confirm a long-held idea. He went to bed thinking about it and woke up on the first day of January with the quiet certainty of someone who knows what the work is and has accepted the work and is ready to go back to it. The year that followed was not simple. No year was. There were days when the resistance inside the facility was more than background noise, when the operations team pushed back hard on a hold, when an engineering lead submitted a counter-assessment that was better than Phil Warren's desk review, but still not good enough, when Frank DeLuca's ambient hostility found a new form and required a direct conversation that was uncomfortable for everyone involved and resulted in Frank transferring to a different facility, which was probably the right outcome for everyone, even if getting there wasn't easy. There were days when Amelia and Logan disagreed about something genuinely, not about safety versus expediency, but about specific decisions that lived in the gray area where reasonable people could look at the same information and come to different conclusions. Those disagreements were the ones Logan valued most, because they required both of them to think carefully and argue honestly and arrive at an answer that was better than the one either of them had started with. That was, he had come to believe, what the relationship was supposed to be. Not agreement, something harder. There were days when the work was simply work. Unglamorous and detailed and requiring the same attention he'd brought to every inspection report for 11 years, just applied to different problems. The kind of days you couldn't make interesting in the telling, but that added up over time into something real. And there were days when it worked exactly as it was supposed to. When a technician filed a report, a secondary inspection was conducted within 3 days. A concern was addressed. An aircraft flew safely, and nobody knew about it because nothing went wrong. Those were the best days. The ones that looked like nothing from the outside and were, from the inside, everything. Ricky Soto was promoted to senior maintenance specialist in April of the following year. He came to Logan's office to tell him not to ask permission, just to share it, the way you shared things with people who'd been part of the story. "Congratulations," Logan said. "Weird, right?" Ricky said. "Same title you had." "Same title, different time." Ricky leaned against the doorframe. He had the look of someone who wanted to say something and was figuring out whether it was appropriate. Logan waited, because he'd learned that waiting worked better than asking. "I think about that morning sometimes," Ricky said. "The unveiling. I was on the floor when everything started happening. When you walked back to the nose of the aircraft with your documentation." He paused. "I didn't think you were going to do it, even knowing what I knew about the reports. I thought you were just going to, I don't know, let it go." "Why?" "Because that's what people do," Ricky said. "Usually, when the cost feels too high." Logan looked at him. "What changed your mind about what I was going to do?" Ricky was quiet for a moment. "You picked up your toolbox," he said, "before you walked over. You picked up your toolbox and you set your coffee down and it was—" He stopped, searching for the word. It was like watching someone who had already decided. Not angry, not making a point, just decided. Logan didn't say anything. "I want to be that kind of decided," Ricky said. "About the work. About what the work is for." Logan thought about what to say to that. He thought about 11 years and Maya and Sophie and the maple tree and fastener point 11 and the folder that had sat on his kitchen table and the pen he'd used to sign his name to a document that said the aircraft was not certified to fly. "You already are," he said. "You just need to keep practicing." Ricky nodded. He pushed off the doorframe. "Okay," he said. And then, with the grin that was becoming a permanent feature of his face, "Senior Maintenance Specialist Carter, Director of Aviation Safety. That's a long career arc." "Don't push it," Logan said. Ricky left. Logan sat in his office for a moment, listening to the facility below. The sounds of the floor, the tools, and the machinery, and the voices of people doing the work that kept things flying. He'd sat in enough silence in enough rooms over the past year to understand what those sounds were and what they required, and to feel, without sentimentality, that he was where he was supposed to be. He thought about Sophie's drawing still on the refrigerator. He'd replaced the tape on it twice because the edges had started to curl. He wasn't ready to take it down. Maybe he never would be. She'd probably be embarrassed by it in 5 years, and he'd show it to her anyway, and she'd groan, and he'd tell her it was the most accurate piece of documentation anyone had ever produced about him, and she'd roll her eyes in the exact way he'd always imagined her rolling her eyes when she was 12. "My dad fixes planes right." He looked out the window at the tarmac. An aircraft was on final approach to the runway, coming in low and clean against the morning sky. Its landing gear down, engines pulling back to idle, making its way toward the ground with all the quiet precision of 10,000 things working correctly at the same time. He watched it land. He went back to work.